Hey guys, tonight we're going back to the late 1500s, the Elizabethan era, a time when May Day wasn't just about flowers and ribbons, but could actually decide who you'd end up marrying. It's a quieter, slower kind of love story, wrapped in tradition and gossip. If you're enjoying these gentle dives into history, give this a like and drop a comment. Tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. Congratulations, you just woke up in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, somewhere between the year 1580 and 1600. You're in London, though it feels like a very different city from the one you might know today. The skyline is lower, the streets narrower, and the air is heavy with the scent of wood smoke and damp river breeze from the Thames. The bells from nearby churches carry through the morning fog, reminding you, and everyone else, that it is the 1st of May, the day when green leaves, fresh flowers, and old customs take over every market square, village green, and cobblestone alley. May Day in Elizabethan London was a curious blend of merriment, superstition, and quiet matchmaking. To the casual observer, it might have looked like an innocent celebration of spring. People weaving flower garlands, musicians setting up their lutes and shawms, and young men carrying tall wooden poles to be set into the ground. But to those who lived in the period, May Day was also an unspoken opportunity to make decisions about courtship, alliances, and, in some cases, marriage itself. The preparations began days in advance. Housewives sent their children into nearby meadows to gather fresh flowers, and the youngest boys in a parish might be tasked with finding the straightest, tallest young tree they could manage, to be stripped of its bark, smoothed, and decorated as the maypole. Apprentices from the city's guilds often went out at dawn to fetch in the May, cutting down greenery from the surrounding countryside. For many Londoners, this was one of the few occasions to venture beyond the city walls without a specific errand. Of course, Elizabethan society was sharply divided by class. The wealthy celebrated May Day with elaborate pageants in their manor courtyards or hired travelling performers to stage plays and dances. The poorer classes, however, crowded into the city's open spaces, Cheapside, Southwark, and village greens just outside the gates, where the festivities were more communal. But in both worlds, the maypole stood as the centerpiece, tall, decorated with ribbons, flowers, and sometimes even gilded ornaments. You might imagine the dancing around the pole as a simple country game, but in reality, each movement carried meaning. Partners were chosen, often in front of the entire community, and weaving the ribbons together was a way of publicly pairing yourself with someone, even if just for the day. For the young and unmarried, it could be the first socially acceptable chance to spend time with a potential partner without the strict eye of a chaperone hovering too closely. The dancing was not purely symbolic. Folk belief tied May Day activities to luck, fertility, and prosperity. A girl who was asked to dance early in the day might quietly interpret it as a sign of romantic interest. A young man who ended up in the same weaving pattern more than once might consider it a subtle encouragement. Sometimes, these dances sparked whispered arrangements between families, particularly in small communities where every action was noticed and remembered. Still, the public nature of May Day meant that not all interactions were romantic. Groups of friends might choose each other as dance partners simply for fun, and some mischievous souls used the day as an opportunity for pranks. Records from the period mention young men stealing maypoles from rival neighbourhoods in the night before the festival, or decorating them with slightly insulting symbols meant to tease another parish. If you were in London during this time, you would also notice that May Day was one of the few occasions when the usual social order could bend, if only slightly. Apprentices could flirt with the daughters of tradesmen, farmers might try their luck with a city maiden, and laughter often rang louder than formal manners. It wasn't quite an overturning of the hierarchy, but for a single day, it allowed for a gentler, more playful version of social interaction. In some parishes, the May Queen tradition was also observed. A young woman, often the most admired in the village, though sometimes chosen for her skill in dancing or singing, would be crowned with a garland and lead the procession. Being chosen was a mark of honor, but it also came with expectations. The May Queen was supposed to embody virtue, grace, and the prosperity of the coming summer. She might be partnered with a May King for the day's festivities, but unlike modern pageants, this role could quietly influence how others saw her suitability for marriage. Not all were in favor of May Day celebrations. The Puritans, growing in influence during the latter part of Elizabeth's reign, disapproved of what they saw as frivolity and moral looseness. To them, the open dancing, mixed company, and pagan origins of the customs were suspect. They pushed for stricter observance of religious holidays and sought to suppress what they considered idolatrous or indecent displays. In some years, these tensions led to smaller celebrations or quieter observances. But in most parts of the city, tradition was strong enough to survive the criticism. Food and drink were an essential part of the day. Bakers prepared special sweet buns, spiced with nutmeg or cinnamon. Brewers increased their production in anticipation of the crowds, and wealthier households might serve roast meats, cheese, and fresh bread to visitors. For poorer families, the festival was an excuse to indulge in simple treats. A tankard of ale, a meat pie from a street vendor, or a handful of sugared almonds. The sharing of food itself could be part of the courtship ritual. Offering a sweetmeat to someone you hoped to impress was both generous and socially acceptable. Music filled the air from morning until evening. Traveling musicians, fiddlers, pipers, drummers, roamed from one maypole to the next, collecting coins for their efforts. Songs were often bawdy, though some were more sentimental ballads about love in the countryside. You might also hear the clatter of Morris dancers, their bells jingling and wooden sticks striking in rhythm. The soundscape of May Day was as important as the sights. It signaled to everyone that this was a day apart from the ordinary routine. As the afternoon wore on, the dancing often became looser, the patterns less precise, and the laughter louder. Young people who had begun the day shyly standing at the edges now joined in more freely. The weaving of ribbons around the pole created a bright, tangled pattern, and while it would be unwound or cut away at the end of the day, it served as a visible memory of who danced with whom and how often. But perhaps the most intriguing part of May Day in Elizabethan London was what happened after the dancing ended. Families who had observed their children's choices might quietly begin discussions with neighbours. Promises could be made, or at least considered, based on a few hours of shared movement around the maypole. The festival itself did not guarantee marriage, but it often set the stage for the months ahead. And yet, as twilight fell and the crowds dispersed, not every pairing made in the morning still held by nightfall. Friendships shifted, alliances formed and dissolved, and the rhythms of daily life returned. But the memory of that one day, and the decisions it inspired, could linger far longer than the ribbons on the maypole. Which makes you wonder, for the people who danced that day, was the maypole just a symbol of spring, or something more, a turning point in the quiet negotiations of Elizabethan love? If Section 1 placed you at the edge of the green, watching the maypole rise, Section 2 draws you closer, into the conversations, the customs, and the careful dance of intentions behind the bright ribbons. By now, the morning's dew has dried, the sun is higher over the rooftops, and London's streets are filled with the scent of crushed grass, trampled flowers, and the occasional whiff of roasting meat from nearby stalls. The thing about Elizabethan courtship, especially for those not born into the nobility, was that it lived in a world of unspoken rules. Very few outright declarations of love or interest were made in public. Instead, feelings were conveyed through gestures, eye contact, and, perhaps most importantly, the rituals of shared activities. May Day dancing was a perfect vessel for this, because it allowed people to be seen together without the formality of a proposal. A young apprentice, for example, might have spent weeks or even months planning his May Day approach. He could not simply stroll up to a merchant's daughter in the marketplace and suggest marriage. That would have been socially clumsy, even presumptuous. But if he could position himself in the line of dancers, so that the ribbons naturally brought them side by side, laughing as their paths crossed again and again, the entire parish would notice. In a culture where community opinion carried real weight, these small acts could be enough to set tongues wagging. And sometimes, that was exactly the point. Parents watched these interactions carefully. Marriage was rarely only about romance. For tradesmen and craftsmen, marrying well meant strengthening a family's business connections. For farmers or smallholders living just outside London, it could mean gaining a better market for their goods. And so, while the young people might focus on the excitement of the dance, the older generation saw it as an opportunity to assess character, work ethic, and the kind of social skills that mattered in sustaining a household. Clothing also played a role in the unspoken language of May Day. The day was one of the few times when even modest families might wear a slightly finer tunic or gown than usual. Fresh ribbons in a girl's hair, a new leather belt for a young man, or a shirt stitched with brighter thread could all signal readiness for courtship. Colour choice mattered too. Green was associated with vitality, red with affection, and white with purity. The combination of colours in a person's clothing could be read, intentionally or not, as part of their message to the community. While the maypole was the most visible centre of attention, other games and customs swirled around it. Some villages held contests, archery for the men, singing or weaving for the women, though in the city, space was often too limited for large competitions. Still, even small amusements could hold meaning. A well-aimed throw in a game of quoits, a sort of ring toss could draw cheers and admiration, and a shared laugh over a fumbled attempt might spark a more relaxed connection than the formalities of the dance. For Londoners, May Day was not only a social event, but also a brief return to an older, rural rhythm. In a city increasingly crowded and dominated by trade, the festival evoked the countryside, even for those who had never worked the land themselves. The greenery brought in to decorate streets and homes was more than just pretty. It was a reminder of the fertility of the land, the changing seasons, and the hope for a good harvest. That connection between fertility of the soil and fertility of marriage prospects was not lost on the Elizabethans. The sounds of the day were almost as important as its sights. The deep thrum of drums, the bright chirp of flutes, the irregular clapping of hands, all worked together to create a sensory frame for the dances. The musicians were often locals, sometimes supplemented by travelling players, hoping to earn a few pennies. For some musicians, this was the most lucrative day of the year, as every group of dancers wanted accompaniment, and no celebration was complete without it. Yet not every Londoner approved of these noisy gatherings. The Puritan influence already noted in Section 1 often expressed itself in complaints about licentiousness, a word that could mean anything from too much alcohol being consumed to dancers seen as immodest. There are surviving pamphlets from the period in which stern moralists lament the way May Day, who looses tongues and stirs base affections, suggesting that the dances led to inappropriate behaviour once darkness fell. Whether these fears were exaggerated or not, they reflect the growing tension in English society between traditional festivities and stricter moral codes. Still, the Queen herself enjoyed May Day celebrations in her youth, and as long as Elizabeth lived, the festival was not outlawed. Royal endorsement gave it a kind of protective charm. On occasion, the court would stage its own version, with elaborate costumes, expensive banquets, and music fit for noble ears. But the underlying spirit was the same, the marking of spring's arrival and the mingling of people in a shared space of joy. Interestingly, the maypole itself was sometimes given a ceremonial history by the community. In certain parishes, the same pole was used year after year, repaired and repainted as needed, almost like an heirloom. In others, a new pole was cut each year, symbolizing renewal. In either case, its erection was a moment of collective effort. Young men hauling it upright, ropes straining, onlookers cheering when it stood tall and straight. That moment of triumph, before the ribbons were even attached, could set the tone for the whole day. Once the dancing began in earnest, you could read a surprising amount from who partnered with whom, and for how long. A young woman who accepted a second or third turn with the same man was almost certainly showing interest. If she declined, It was a gentle but public signal that she saw no future in the match. The choice of partner was thus a social statement made in full view of neighbors and relatives. This is why some couples would wait until later in the day, when the crowd was looser and attention less fixed, to make their more telling dances. By mid-afternoon, the effects of ale and cider were evident in many participants. Laughter grew louder, the dances less precise, and sometimes long-standing disputes between families would flare briefly, only to be smoothed over by peacemakers. The festival was a pressure valve for community tensions as much as a stage for courtship. It allowed grievances to be aired, sometimes literally, through bawdy songs, without escalating into serious conflict. As the sun began to sink, those interested in more private conversations often slipped away from the main green. A walk along a quieter lane, or a pause by the riverbank, could offer a few minutes of semi-privacy in a world where privacy was rare. Words spoken in those moments might lead to formal negotiations in the weeks ahead. For others, they were simply the pleasant, fleeting connections of a festival, remembered fondly but not pursued further. Yet, for all its gaiety, May Day was also tinged with an awareness that it was temporary. The very act of weaving ribbons around a pole that would be bare again by morning mirrored the nature of courtship, colourful, intertwined for a moment, and then undone. In a city where fortunes could change with a bad harvest, a lost ship, or a sudden illness, such fleeting joys were both a comfort and a reminder of life's unpredictability. And so, as the evening's final dances began, one could not help but wonder, in this web of ribbons, glances, and unspoken agreements, which pairings would endure, and which would fade before the next May Day arrived. Evening in Elizabethan London fell more slowly in May than in the darker months. But by the time the last light clung to the sky, the air had cooled and the festival had shifted tone. What began in the clear brightness of morning, the smell of fresh, cut greenery, the chatter of vendors, the cheerful bustle of raising the maypole, now softened into something more intimate, more measured. The music slowed, lanterns and torches flickered in the breeze, and the crowd thinned as older townsfolk made their way home. For those who remained, this was the most significant time of the day. The twilight hours offered a curious mixture of freedom and scrutiny. On the one hand, the dimming light created a sense of privacy. Faces were less visible, conversations less easily overheard. On the other, everyone who remained was, in some way, being noticed. Staying late at a May Day dance was not inherently improper, but it did suggest a willingness to engage in the less formal, less structured interactions that followed. The final dances were looser affairs. The weaving of ribbons around the maypole had usually been completed by now, the bright strands wrapped tight in a neat, intricate spiral. Instead, people formed smaller circles or paired off entirely, moving at their own pace to the softer notes of lutes, viols, or voices singing ballads. This was the moment when a young man could make his intentions clearer. A request for a slow, deliberate dance held more weight now than it had in the bustling morning. Sometimes these final hours brought together couples who had avoided each other earlier in the day. A girl might have been busy dancing with friends, or a boy might have hesitated to approach in front of his peers. But with fewer eyes on them, and a gentler atmosphere, such hesitations faded. For a lucky few, the evening's final partner was the one who would be spoken of in weeks to come, when parents began arranging visits and discussing prospects. The festival's influence on marriage was not merely the result of these dances, however. May Day acted as a public ledger of sorts, a display of who was interested in whom, who seemed well liked, and who could carry themselves with grace and good humor in a crowd. In a society where reputation was a form of currency, these impressions mattered as much as family connections or dowries. A young man who danced with multiple partners and was still welcomed into conversation afterward was seen as amiable and respectable. One who sulked after rejection might be quietly judged as lacking the temperament for marriage. As for the maypole itself, the end of the day marked a change in its symbolism. In some parishes, it was left standing for several weeks, its ribbons fluttering in the wind until weather or time wore them away. In others, it was taken down the next morning, stored carefully for the following year. Either way, it stood through the night as a silent witness to the day's interactions, a reminder to all who passed it in the days ahead of the dances, glances, and conversations it had hosted. It's worth noting that not all May Day matches were destined for long-term happiness. Some were formed out of convenience or seasonal optimism, rather than true compatibility. Records from parish registers in the late 1500s suggest that while some couples married within a year of their public pairing, others quietly drifted apart, marrying entirely different partners later on. The festival, for all its hopeful undertones, was more a catalyst than a guarantee. Still, for many, it provided a rare and cherished memory. Imagine an apprentice recalling his first May Day in the city, the swirl of colours, the unexpected moment when the girl he'd admired for months took his hand, or a young woman remembering the gentle humour of a stranger who made her laugh during a misstep in the ribbon dance. These recollections, however small, could linger for years, colouring the way people thought about the festival long after the practical details were forgotten. In the broader sense, May Day in Elizabethan London reveals something about how societies manage the tension between structure and spontaneity. The day was rooted in long-standing tradition, with its rituals, symbols, and expectations. Yet within that framework, individuals could express themselves more freely than on most other days of the year. It was both a controlled performance and a genuine opportunity for connection, a balance that may explain its enduring appeal, even in the face of moral criticism. As darkness deepened and the last of the music faded into the soft hum of the city night, the green began to empty. Lanterns were doused, the last jugs of ale drained, and stray ribbons trampled into the grass. Couples who had spent the day together might linger at the edge of the green before parting ways, promising to see each other at church, at market, or perhaps at another festival later in the summer. Friends walked home in small groups, laughing over the day's events. Somewhere, perhaps, a newly formed pair was already thinking ahead to the conversations with parents, the weighing of fortunes and trades, the long negotiations that could lead to a betrothal. Others simply let the day slip into memory, content with its brief joy. In the end, May Day in Elizabethan London was never just about the pole, the ribbons, or even the dancing. It was about what those things allowed, a momentary softening of the rules, a chance for glances to become conversations, and conversations to become possibilities. For some, it changed the course of life. For others, it was simply a pleasant interruption in the slow, steady turning of the year. And perhaps that is the true charm of it. That one day could hold so much meaning, yet remain so ordinary in the eyes of history. It leaves you wondering, how many lives were quietly reshaped under the flickering lanterns of a May Day evening, only to vanish from the record, leaving behind nothing but a tangled ribbon and a half-remembered tune. London in the late 19th century was a city of strict manners and hidden meanings. On the surface, its streets bustled with carriages, hansom cabs, and the constant rattle of iron-shod wheels over cobblestone. But behind the polished doors of drawing rooms and parlours, another form of movement was taking place. The careful exchange of small rectangles of card, each no bigger than the palm of your hand, carrying messages without a single written sentence. Calling cards, or visiting cards, as they were sometimes known, were more than simple introductions. They were an entire social system, a set of silent codes that could grant entry into certain circles, mark the beginning of an acquaintance, or signal the cooling of a relationship. For the middle and upper classes of Victorian London, they were as essential to social navigation as street maps were to the city itself. The ritual of the calling card began at the front door. Every respectable household employed a servant, often a maid or footman, whose role included receiving visitors. But in most cases, the visitor did not step inside. Instead, they handed over their card, sometimes accompanied by a short verbal message, and the servant placed it on a silver tray in the hallway. These trays were not purely practical. They were on display, allowing other guests to see the names and connections of the household. A typical Victorian calling card bore the name of the individual, sometimes preceded by an honorific such as Messer or Miss. For gentlemen, the design was often plain, black or dark grey ink on a cream background, no flourishes beyond, perhaps a modest monogram. Ladies' cards might include elegant script, embossed borders, or even a delicate floral motif, though excessive decoration could be seen as pretentious. Titles and addresses were included for those of higher rank or social importance, but never in a way that seemed boastful. The unspoken rules began with delivery. If you were calling for the first time, you presented your card in person, but rarely expected to be invited in unless your visit had been arranged in advance. The act itself, arriving in a carriage, walking up the steps, and handing the card to the servant, was part of establishing your presence in someone's social orbit. The recipient could choose to respond by returning the visit, thus opening the door to further acquaintance, or by doing nothing, which was a polite way of declining without words. Once a relationship was established, the card's corner might be folded to convey additional meaning. The top right corner turned down indicated a personal visit. The bottom left folded meant congratulations. The bottom right could signal condolence. These small alterations were instantly recognized by those accustomed to the system, saving the sender from writing even a single sentence. To outsiders, and especially to the working classes who rarely dealt with such customs, these folded corners might seem trivial, but in polite society, they could alter the course of an interaction. Timing also mattered. Calls were generally made in the afternoon, between 3 and 5 o'clock, when ladies of the house were most likely to be at home. Calling outside these hours risked catching someone unprepared and could be taken as a slight. Even the day of the week could carry significance. Friday calls, for instance, might signal a social invitation for the weekend ahead. For newly married couples, calling cards served as a formal announcement of their arrival in society. Within weeks of the wedding, they would send or deliver cards to acquaintances, often marked with both names in smaller print beneath the husband's, a subtle reinforcement of the social structure. Those who received such cards were expected to return the gesture within a set time, thereby acknowledging the couple's place in the network of relationships. The calling card was also a tool of quiet exclusion. Failing to return a call, or sending a card without an invitation to call again, could signal disapproval or distance. Such decisions were rarely made hastily. They were the result of careful consideration, especially in a city where every connection might bring both advantages and obligations. But once made, they could be as final as any spoken rejection. In households where social standing was paramount, the display of calling cards in the entrance hall became a silent testament to influence. A tray brimming with cards from titled families, prominent businessmen, or fashionable hostesses suggested a household in good standing. Conversely, a sparse or modest collection might raise quiet questions about the family's connections. Guests sometimes scanned these trays while waiting to be received, reading them like an unspoken ledger of status. Yet for all the rigidity of the system, there was also room for quiet strategy. Some individuals used calling cards to subtly advance their position, sending them to households just above their own station in hopes of being drawn into a higher circle. Others used them to manage relationships, keeping contact with some and letting others drift away without confrontation. It was, in a way, a form of social bookkeeping, where each card represented an entry in an invisible ledger. What made this system particularly striking was how much could be conveyed without speech. A simple rectangle of card, properly timed and correctly presented, could open doors that words alone might not. And conversely, a missed call, a folded corner in the wrong place, or a card left unanswered could quietly close them. As the 19th century drew on, industrial printing made calling cards more affordable, and the practice began to spread beyond the aristocracy into the growing middle class. But this expansion only increased the importance of knowing the rules, for in a city as vast and varied as London, making the wrong impression could still have lasting effects. It leaves one to wonder, in an era where so much of social life depended on these tiny slips of paper, how many friendships, marriages, and business alliances began, or ended, with the discreet placement of a single card on a silver tray. By the 1870s, the calling card ritual had reached its most elaborate form. What had once been a fairly simple courtesy had become a finely tuned system of timing, presentation, and social arithmetic. It was no longer enough merely to own a set of cards. One had to know exactly when and how to use them. For the newly arrived in London society, whether a young woman fresh from finishing school or a gentleman returning from service abroad, the first challenge was understanding the hierarchy of visits. Morning calls were so named not because they occurred before noon, but because they were made during the formal calling hours of the afternoon, typically between 3 and 5 o'clock. In the upper echelons, it was common for hostesses to designate specific, at-home days, perhaps the first and third Thursday of each month, on which they would receive visitors. These dates were sometimes printed discreetly in the lower corner of their calling card, allowing regular acquaintances to plan their visits without prior arrangement. The precision extended to how cards were delivered. While a personal visit was the most direct method, cards could also be left by a servant or sent by post, though the latter was considered less intimate. For particularly large gatherings or events, such as the opening of a new home or a daughter's coming out, a stack of cards might be distributed in advance to invite acquaintances to attend. The number of cards you sent, and to whom, was carefully noted and often discussed among the recipients. There was also the delicate matter of reciprocity. In theory, every card received deserved a return card within a reasonable time frame, generally within a fortnight. In practice, however, the decision to respond, and the manner of doing so, could convey acceptance, hesitation, or polite refusal. A card returned in person indicated genuine interest in maintaining the connection. A card sent by servant, without an accompanying visit, suggested courtesy, but little more. No response at all was a quiet, but unmistakable sign of disinterest. For women, especially unmarried women of the upper and middle classes, calling cards were also a way to navigate the strict boundaries of propriety. A young lady could not simply visit a gentleman unaccompanied, but she could send a card to his household, more often to his mother or sister, as an indirect expression of acquaintance. If the household responded favorably, it opened the door for her to be invited to larger gatherings where the gentleman might be present. In this way, the calling card was both a safeguard and a strategic tool in courtship. Men, too, had their own set of rules. A bachelor might use a calling card to express interest in a social connection without overstepping the bounds of formality. In business, cards were essential for networking, though they differed slightly from the purely social kind, often including a profession or office address. Blending business and personal connections could be risky, and the ability to manage both sets of cards without causing offense was a skill in itself. Some families maintained elaborate ledgers to track their calling card exchanges, noting who had visited, who had responded, and which relationships were growing warmer or cooler. These records could span years, revealing the slow evolution of social networks. A cousin who drifted into disuse after a disagreement, a former school friend who rose in society and began to send cards less frequently, a newly married couple who appeared suddenly in multiple households' records after an advantageous match. There were, of course, moments when the system could be manipulated. Ambitious families sometimes sent cards to households far above their own station, hoping to be mistaken for acquaintances of a mutual friend. Others relied on the subtle prestige of being seen in connection with certain names. A card left visible in the hall, even if the relationship was distant, could create the impression of a closer link than actually existed. The etiquette also extended to seasonal changes. During the height of the London season, the months between Easter and mid-summer when the aristocracy filled the city, calling card exchanges were at their most intense. Households might receive dozens of cards in a single day, each one needing a timely and appropriate reply. By contrast, during the quieter months, the exchange slowed, and a single card might stand out more in the reduced social traffic. An overlooked but important detail was the care taken in the presentation of the card itself. Paper quality, ink, and even the cut of the card all conveyed subtle messages. A thick, high-quality card stock suggested permanence and respectability, while a flimsy or poorly printed card could imply carelessness or a lack of means. The size of the card, too, had meaning. Smaller cards were often used by women, larger by men. In the case of widows, a black border signaled mourning, its thickness indicating the depth of the loss and gradually narrowing as time passed. In some households, the silver tray of calling cards was more than a social record. It was a source of decoration and pride. Arranged neatly in layers, it allowed guests to see the breadth of the family's connections. A tray displaying the card of a titled aristocrat, alongside those of respected professionals, spoke to a well-balanced social standing. Conversely, the absence of such names could suggest a narrowing of influence. Yet, despite its apparent stiffness, the calling card system could be unexpectedly human. Servants often acted as intermediaries, and their impressions of visitors sometimes colored the way messages were received. A polite word to a footman or a shared joke with a maid might soften the tone of a formal visit, making it more likely that the recipient would view it favorably. In an age before telephones and instant communication, this quiet, deliberate exchange of cards was a way of pacing relationships, allowing them to develop slowly, under the careful gaze of etiquette. But with every fold of a corner, every delay in returning a card, and every tray placed by the front door, small decisions were shaping the web of Victorian society, and so one can't help but ask how many opportunities, alliances, or affections in Victorian London were lost, not through harsh words or open rejection, but through the simple, silent absence of a little white card. By the late Victorian era, the calling card tradition was beginning to show the first faint signs of change. New technologies, the penny post, the telegram, and even the early telephone, were quietly intruding upon the realm of face-to-face formality. Yet, in most polite households, the ritual of the card still reigned supreme. It remained the first step in meeting a new acquaintance, the safest method for acknowledging a favor, and the gentlest way to decline an invitation without uttering a single discourteous word. One of the subtler charms of the system was its ability to serve as a form of slow, deliberate communication. A card might be sent after a dinner party, expressing gratitude without obliging the recipient to answer at once. Another could arrive unexpectedly on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, hinting at a wish for renewed contact after months of silence. There was an unspoken poetry in this, a kind of social Morse code, where meaning was conveyed not only by the message itself, but by its timing, delivery, and presentation. For those skilled in reading these signs, the calling card tray was a treasure trove of intelligence. A name reappearing after an absence might signal a reconciliation. A corner folded precisely at the top right could indicate that the sender had delivered the card personally and was present in the drawing room awaiting an audience. A left handfold might suggest that the visit was purely ceremonial, perhaps marking a holiday or a birthday. There were also seasonal flourishes to the ritual. At Christmas time, many London households exchanged special holiday calling cards, sometimes printed with festive borders or embossed with holly and ivy motifs. These were less formal than the standard card, but no less meaningful, as they marked a willingness to share in the quiet goodwill of the season. Similarly, during times of mourning, cards bore their black borders, a visual cue that dictated the tone of any future contact. Restrained, respectful, and subdued, the calling card's influence extended beyond London itself. For those spending summers in the country or winters abroad, cards became a portable emblem of identity. British travellers carried them to European spas, seaside resorts, and colonial outposts, using them to announce their arrival in a manner that was universally understood among the educated classes. The ritual became a kind of cultural passport, signalling both refinement and familiarity with the invisible rules that bound polite society together. But for all its elegance, the practice was not without critics. Some dismissed it as an empty performance, a way of pretending at connection without making any real effort. Others, especially those from outside the narrow circles of high society, saw it as a barrier rather than a bridge. To them, the calling card system was less about communication and more about exclusion, a way to mark who did and did not belong. By the turn of the 20th century, these criticisms were joined by practical realities. Life in the city was changing, households were less formal, servants were fewer, and people increasingly preferred the speed of newer forms of contact. Social columns in London newspapers began to remark on the decline of calling card etiquette, noting that younger people found the practice quaint, even old-fashioned. By the time the First World War erupted, the silver trays in many homes had been put away, their stacks of cards replaced by correspondence that arrived in envelopes or by voices heard directly over the telephone line. And yet, the calling card never entirely vanished. In some quiet corners of London, and in the great country houses that still clung to tradition, the trays lingered on, a reminder of a slower, more deliberate age. Even now, a handful of private clubs and old families preserve the ritual, seeing in it not just a form of politeness, but an art, the art of making an introduction without saying a word. It is perhaps fitting that the calling card's greatest legacy lies not in the cards themselves, but in the idea they embodied that every meeting, every new connection deserved a moment of ceremony. In a city as vast and changeable as Victorian London, the simple act of placing a small rectangle of card upon a silver tray was a way of saying, "I have come to your door, and I hope we might meet again." And for all the gossip, strategizing, and careful maneuvering that surrounded the practice, there is something undeniably soothing in the thought that an entire society once moved to the gentle rhythm of small white cards quietly exchanged across a city that never stopped watching. The first gas lamps flickered to life in London in 1807, casting their pale, steady glow along a short stretch of Pall Mall. At first, it was an experiment, a curiosity for evening promenaders to remark upon. But it would quietly reshape the city's social rhythms in ways no one entirely predicted. Before the lamps, London at night belonged mostly to those who had reason to be out. After dark, night watchmen, patrolling with their rattles and lanterns, seat armchair porters ferrying the wealthy home from dinners, tavern goers stumbling through narrow lanes, and occasional thieves hoping the shadows would hide them. Courtship, if it happened outdoors in the evening, relied on the brief half-light after sunset, or the discreet glow of a candle glimpsed through a window. Gaslight changed that. It stretched the usable hours of the city. Streets that once felt dangerous or entirely deserted after dusk began to welcome walkers. Respectable ones too. It meant a gentleman might offer to escort a lady home after a theatre performance, without the journey being a hurried dash through gloom. It meant couples could stroll arm in arm along newly lit avenues, speaking in low voices under the gentle halo of light. In those early years, the novelty of illumination was itself a subject for conversation. Men commented on the brilliance of the lamps compared to the old oil lanterns, while women noted how the light flattered, or failed to flatter, the colours of a gown. Pall Mall's gaslights were bright enough. One could read a printed notice affixed to a wall, a feat unimaginable in most of London's lanes. This visibility began to shift the unwritten rules of public behaviour. Before gaslight, the dark offered cover for subtle gestures in courtship. A quick touch of the hand, a lingering pause at the door, the tilt of a bonnet to shield a glance. Darkness gave plausible deniability to interactions that might be frowned upon in daylight. With illumination came exposure. Now, conversations could be overheard by passers-by, movements observed from a distance. It required new strategies for discretion, and new opportunities for display. A couple walking under the lamps was not only seen by each other, but by everyone they passed. The shift also altered the social geography of romance. Some areas of the city became known as respectable evening promenades. Safe, well-lit stretches where chaperones might permit a walk. Regent Street, once opened in the 1820s, combined wide pavements with regular lamps, drawing not just shoppers but also those simply wishing to be seen. In these spaces, courtship became something almost theatrical. The right lighting could turn a casual meeting into an event charged with possibility. Yet, Outside these glowing corridors, the city still harbored darkness. The further one strayed from the lamp-lined routes, the more quickly the shadows returned. Couples intent on privacy might choose quieter, less lit streets, risking the uneven paving and occasional watchman's suspicion for a moment of solitude. In this way, the lamps didn't eliminate old patterns entirely, they simply added new options, and with them, new decisions. Merchants noticed the change, too. Confectioners stayed open later to catch the evening stroll trade, selling sugared almonds and candied ginger to couples enjoying the novelty of night shopping. Music drifted from tavern doors, now more inviting under the warm circles of light. Even the city's postal service subtly adjusted its timetables, knowing letters might be posted later in the evening by those out on a romantic errand. Still, gaslighting the whole city was a gradual process, and for years, the glow was patchy. A walk from the West End to the city could take one through bright stretches, and then into deep shadow, then back into light. This contrast shaped the mood of a romantic evening, moments of openness under the lamps, alternating with pockets of intimacy where the darkness closed in. Each lent its own texture to a relationship, the public ease of being visible, and the private thrill of being unseen. By the mid-19th century, Londoners had begun to weave these lamp-lit possibilities into the very fabric of courtship. Theatres scheduled performances with an eye to the gaslit journey home. Flower sellers positioned themselves along lit routes, knowing a gentleman might buy a posy for his companion in full view of admiring onlookers. The light, however, was not without critics. Some mourned the loss of the romantic mystery the shadows once provided. Poets complained that gaslight bleached the moonlight from the streets. Older residents muttered that the city felt less like London and more like a showroom. But younger couples embraced it, using the lamps as beacons in an ever-growing metropolis. In this shifting landscape of night, romance adapted, not in grand gestures, but in the small details of where to walk, when to pause, and how to navigate the thin boundary between public and private. The lamps became silent participants in countless conversations, witnesses to proposals, partings, and tentative beginnings. What no one yet realized was how this new rhythm of illuminated evenings would ripple beyond courtship, influencing the way Londoners worked, shopped, and even thought about time itself. And in the quiet hours after midnight, when the lamps still burned and the streets were nearly empty, a different kind of romance began to emerge, one that belonged entirely to the night. By the 1830s, gaslight was no longer a rare novelty in London's fashionable districts. It was an expectation. A neighbourhood without proper lighting seemed backward, unfriendly, and perhaps even unsafe. This expectation began to shape where couples chose to meet, where they strolled, and even which parts of the city they considered romantic. For many, the theatre district became the heart of lamp-lit romance. Covent Garden, Drury Lane, and the Strand bustled after sunset, their entrances glowing with rows of glass-encased flames. Inside, the footlights bathed actors in a golden haze, while outside, gas lamps lit the street like an open-air salon. Theatregoers lingered after performances, knowing the walk home could now be an extension of the evening's pleasurers. A leisurely promenade past bookshops, confectioners, and coffee houses still open for business. This expansion of social hours was subtle but transformative. Previously, darkness dictated the city's schedule. Evenings were short, dinners early, and any outing after sunset was a calculated decision, not a casual one. Gaslight shifted that balance. A young man could now suggest a meeting at 7 in the evening without it feeling scandalously late. A lady's family might permit her to stay out until nearly 10, confident that she could return along lit streets. The lamp posts stood like silent chaperones, visible, impartial, and constant. Couples found new rituals in this extended twilight. Window shopping became a favored pastime as store displays glittered beneath the lamps. Jewelers especially took advantage of the gaslight, arranging diamond rings and brooches in ways that made them sparkle irresistibly. A man escorting his sweetheart might pause at such a display, their reflections faint in the glass, each imagining a future where those trinkets were not just for looking. But the glow of the lamps also brought a curious new challenge. being seen. Courtship in darkness had allowed for a certain freedom of expression. Courtship under gaslight required a careful balance between openness and propriety. A gentleman might be eager to offer his arm, but he knew his gesture could be observed from across the street. A woman might enjoy the attention, yet be mindful that her gown, her posture, even the tilt of her bonnet, could be remarked upon by strangers. In some parts of London, this visibility gave rise to an almost playful form of public theatre. The lamp-lit promenade became a known spectacle in the West End, especially on mild spring nights. Strollers dressed in their best coats and gowns, moving in a slow, deliberate circuit past the same stretches of light. It was not only about the person at one side, but about the way the pair appeared together, an unspoken presentation of taste, compatibility, and status. Yet outside the glow of the main boulevards, intimacy still found its refuge. Lovers who sought privacy could turn into quieter, dimly lit side streets, where the lamps were fewer and spaced far apart. There, in the pauses between pools of light, they might whisper more freely, unbothered by the watchful eyes of passers-by. These darker lanes were the last vestiges of an older London, where night was not something to be lit away, but something to be navigated. The city authorities, however, had their own vision. As gas companies extended their networks, they mapped a London in which darkness would be a rarity. Each year, more streets were added to the grid of illumination, and with every new lamppost came the gentle erasure of the city's hidden corners. Not everyone welcomed it. Romanticists argued that something ineffable was being lost. Those private shadows where quiet confessions felt safer, where the only witness was the moon. Still, the march of light was steady. By the 1840s, lamp-lit evenings were the setting for countless proposals, quarrels, reconciliations, and first meetings. Even in the drizzle, when the light shivered on wet cobblestones, there was a certain magic in the way the city glowed. Gaslight made rain look like silver, and lovers walking beneath it might remember that shimmer long after they'd forgotten the exact words they spoke. In time, the lamps became so entwined with London's romantic life that they appeared in novels, poems, and songs. Writers spoke of the warmth of the street lamp's gaze, as if each post carried a quiet personality, a witness to the small dramas of love. And while the lamps themselves were practical inventions, their presence in the city's imagination became almost human, steadfast companions to the lonely, subtle conspirators to the enamored. But there was still more change ahead, for the gaslight's influence on romance would not stop with evening strolls and extended theatre nights. As London grew brighter, its very patterns of meeting, courting, and declaring affection would evolve into something the city had never seen before, something only possible in a place that no longer feared the dark. By the middle of the 19th century, London's gaslit romance had moved beyond the casual stroll. The city's infrastructure of light was beginning to shape entirely new kinds of encounters, new orules for courtship, and even new spaces designed specifically for meeting under its glow. Public gardens were one of the first to change. The Vauxhall Gardens, already famous for music, dancing, and discreet flirtations, extended their evening hours deep into the night, confident that the warm haze of gaslight would make the grounds safer and more inviting. Couples could walk through avenues of lit trees, each branch decorated with hundreds of small lamps that seemed to float like fireflies above the gravel paths. For a shilling, a young man could take his sweetheart to hear an orchestra under a sky dotted with real stars above and artificial ones below. Such spaces also allowed a certain theatricality in romance. A proposal delivered beneath a lit archway felt public yet safe, witnessed but not intruded upon. These moments often became local legend. People remembered where they saw the young Miss So, and so accept Mr. What's his name's offer, recalling the very pattern of light falling across her bonnet. But light did more than illuminate. It became part of the unspoken language of love. There were favourite lampposts where couples arranged to meet. There were spots in Hyde Park where the reflection of the lamps in the Serpentine gave the water a ghostly sheen, making it a place for whispered confidences. Even in residential districts, Lovers might pass beneath a certain street lamp on purpose, knowing the way it cast a soft glow that made every gesture seem gentler, every glance linger longer. The lamp-lit city also expanded who could meet whom. Before gaslight, respectable women rarely ventured far after sunset without family or a servant. But as streets became safer, or at least felt safer, mixed gatherings became easier. A gentleman could accompany a lady friend from a musical performance back to her home without drawing undue comment. Courting became less about daytime visits in formal parlors and more about shared experiences in the living city, walking, laughing, pointing out the way the lamps shone through fog. Fog itself became a character in this new romance. On damp winter nights, gaslight turned the mist into a shifting, golden veil. Figures appeared and disappeared as they moved through the haze, lending even ordinary moments an air of mystery. Some poets wrote of love in the fog, describing how the blurred edges of the world seemed to draw people closer, how the lamp glow became an island of warmth in an uncertain sea. Of course, not all change was welcomed. Moralists fretted that longer hours in public, particularly in the lively West End, could lead to impropriety. They warned of the dangers of the lamp-lit hour for young women, especially when promenading without an older chaperone. The same light that enabled safe courtship also provided opportunities for less reputable encounters, and London's night police sometimes had to separate amorous couples whose public affections had become a little too public. Still, for most Londoners, gaslight meant more freedom than risk. It allowed the city to live in two distinct halves: the day, full of labour and commerce, and the evening, which belonged to leisure and personal connection. Romance was no longer confined to stolen moments before dusk. It could breathe in the open air of evening, in sight of everyone, yet still feel private in the flicker between lampposts. By the century's end, the gas lamp itself had become a romantic symbol. Even as electric lighting began to spread, lovers clung to the warmer, softer glow of gas. In some districts, lamps were deliberately kept from being converted, cherished for the way they softened the lines of the face and slowed the pace of a walk. There was something about the gaslight's imperfection, the slight hiss, the occasional sputter, that made it feel alive, a companion to those walking home together at night. In truth, the lamps had changed London far more than anyone could have predicted. They had redefined the meaning of going out, expanded the city's courtship rituals, and given romance a public stage without walls or curtains. And while electric bulbs would eventually outshine them, the idea of love under London's lamp-lit streets would linger for generations. A memory of a city that learned how to love after dark, without fear of the dark itself. Perhaps the real change was not the lamps themselves, but what they represented. A moment in history when technology and human connection met halfway, in the quiet glow between two shadows. And if you were to walk those same streets today, you might still find an old gas lamp standing where it has for more than a century, its flame flickering in the night. A small, steady reminder that sometimes the light is as much a part of the romance as the people it shines upon. In the middle decades of the 19th century, when the clatter of horse-drawn omnibuses mingled with the cries of costermongers on London's streets, the postman's knock was more than just a summons to the door. For some, it was the promise of work or the arrival of a bill. For others, particularly those in the long, uncertain courtship that Victorian etiquette demanded, it was a quiet heartbeat of hope. This was the era after the uniform penny post had been introduced in 1840, a reform that lowered the cost of sending a letter anywhere in Britain to a single penny. Before then, postal rates were calculated by distance and sheets of paper, making correspondence a luxury for the wealthy. Now, for the price of a modest cup of tea, a shop assistant in Holborn could send a carefully worded note to her cousin in Brighton, or a young gentleman to the young lady whose acquaintance he had been permitted to make, perhaps under the watchful eyes of her parents at a public concert. But it wasn't just cost that shaped these letters. It was form, tone, and above all, timing. In an age where most courtships unfolded under layers of social formality, the postal service offered an odd sort of intimacy. You could write at midnight, seal your thoughts in wax, and trust them to the early morning collections that rattled away in red, painted mail carts. Victorian London's postal system was far more energetic than many imagine today. There were up to 12 deliveries a day in the central districts, meaning it was entirely possible to send an invitation in the morning and receive a reply by afternoon tea. This speed created an unusual rhythm for romance. Instead of the slow drift of weeks between letters, there could be a brisk, almost conversational exchange. Though always on paper, and always carefully phrased to avoid any hint of impropriety. Letter paper was itself part of the ritual. The quality of the sheet, the smoothness of the laid lines, the neatness of the fold, all carried subtle signals. Stationers along the Strand and Cheapside sold Courtship paper in soft creams and pale blues, lightly scented and trimmed with fine borders. Even the act of folding a page carried meaning. A corner turned down might hint at affection. A second, smaller fold within might indicate a level of secrecy not intended for parental eyes. Sealing wax, too, was a small language. Red wax was traditional for formal or business correspondence, but those engaged in more personal matters sometimes chose black for mourning, gold R's for special announcements, or a muted blue R's for quiet affection. Wax seals bore initials, family crests, or in some cases, small decorative motifs, a sprig of ivy for fidelity, a dove for peace. Not all of these signals were openly acknowledged, but many were understood. A letter was never just a letter. In the world of Victorian romance, it was a negotiation between candour and caution. One might ask, "Did you enjoy the musicale last Thursday?" while really inquiring whether the recipient was thinking of the sender at all. The postman himself was an unseen participant in these exchanges. Dressed in a dark blue uniform with red piping and a glazed leather hat, he made his rounds through rain, fog and soot-laden air. He knew which houses received frequent correspondence and from whom, though propriety prevented him from saying so. Still, in quieter districts, the arrival of a certain postman at a certain time might cause a young woman to happen to be near the front hall, just as the knocker sounded. There was also a subtle choreography to when a letter was posted. To send one too quickly after an encounter might seem over-eager. To delay too long risked cooling the connection. And then there was the matter of handwriting. In an age before the typewriter, one's script was an unmistakable fingerprint. Slanted copperplate, taught in girls' academies, was admired for its grace. Bolder, upright hands, often favoured by men in commerce, could look commanding or brusque. Some practiced their penmanship with the same care as their wardrobe. But of course, all these refinements of etiquette and material would have meant little without the central fact of distance. For many courting couples, especially those of different social classes or from distant towns, letters were the only acceptable means of prolonged contact. Face-to-face meetings were limited, supervised and short. A letter could carry what was unsaid in company, a recollection of a shared glance, an expression of future hopes, a polite but pointed mention of next Thursday's promenade. And so in the narrow space between a sheet of paper and the constraints of propriety, entire relationships unfolded. Some blossomed over months of delicate phrasing, others withered in the absence of reply, and some letters, folded, sealed, and carried through the labyrinth of London streets, never arrived at all. It is perhaps in those missing letters that we find the most tantalizing mystery. How many courtships faltered, not from choice or cooling interest, but because a small piece of paper went astray in the fog of Victorian London. The path of a Victorian love letter began not with a gallop of hooves or the clang of sorting machinery, but with the quiet decision of where to post it. In London, there were pillar boxes set at street corners, discreet enough for someone to slip in a folded confession without attracting the attention of neighbours. There were also receiving houses, small shops or stationers entrusted with a locked box for letters, whose proprietors often became silent witnesses to the ebb and flow of local affections. A letter might be placed in the slot just as the gas lamps were being lit, the sender's hand hesitating a moment before letting it fall. From that instant, the fate of the envelope was in the hands of the General Post Office, a vast, humming system that connected the country in a way nothing else quite did. In the evenings, uniformed mail collectors made their rounds, emptying pillar boxes into leather satchels, each stamped with the royal cipher. These bags were carried to district sorting offices, where the letters were tipped out onto long wooden tables. Here, under the pale glow of oil lamps, clerks in shirt sleeves worked with remarkable speed. They slit open the tied bundles, glanced at each address, and flicked the envelopes into pigeonholes marked for different parts of the city. The clerks themselves were a kind of unseen chorus in the drama of Victorian romance. Some had worked the same route for decades, memorizing the names and streets of their territory. Others, younger and newer, sometimes smiled faintly at an envelope with a spidery copperplate, Miss E, followed by no surname. Knowing such things usually meant a letter was part of an unspoken arrangement between correspondents. Once sorted for central London, a letter might travel only a few streets before reaching its recipient. But if its destination lay in a suburb, Hampstead, perhaps, or Richmond, it would be bundled again and dispatched by mail cart or train. The railway had transformed the reach of the postal service, allowing for astonishingly quick delivery to towns and cities far beyond London's sprawl. A letter posted at 8 in the morning could be read over luncheon in a seaside town by mid-afternoon. Meanwhile, for the letter itself, the journey was entirely without romance. Pressed among hundreds of others in the dark of a canvas bag, it endured jostles, damp air, and the occasional faint scent of tobacco from a postman's coat. The wax seal might crack slightly in the cold. The paper might pick up a faint crease from being wedged against a thicker packet. Yet somehow, the human importance of its contents seemed to survive these indignities. When the bag reached the local office nearest the recipient, the process began again, letters tipped, sorted, and placed in delivery bundles. The postman then set out on foot, his satchel slung from a thick leather strap. Rain or shine, he moved briskly, stopping at each house with a brisk knock, or the clatter of a brass knocker. Imagine, for a moment, the recipient, perhaps a young woman at her embroidery frame in the parlour, glancing at the clock and wondering if today will bring a reply. The sound comes, a sharp rap, the muffled voice of the maid at the door, the thud of the letter placed on the hall table. It lies there for a moment, a small rectangle of folded promise, before she dares to pick it up. Some letters were opened at once, seals broken with quick fingers. Others were carried away to be read in privacy, the corner of a garden, perhaps, or a quiet window seat. The act of reading was never hurried. Words were savoured, sometimes read aloud in a whisper, sometimes traced lightly with a fingertip. And then came the decision to answer at once, or to let the ink rest until the morning. Thus, the postal system of Victorian London became not merely a means of carrying information, but a kind of slow, deliberate heartbeat for romantic lives. Each knock on the door was a pulse, each delivery a new chance for affection to grow, or fade, in the space between pen and paper. It began with a note no longer than a visiting card, posted on a damp February afternoon in 1872. The sender, a junior clerk named Henry Whitcomb, had been introduced briefly to Miss Eleanor Hartley at a church tea the previous week. Their conversation, though brief, had lingered in his mind, not for any particular subject discussed, but for the small details, the way she adjusted the cuff of her glove while listening, the slight upward turn at the corners of her mouth when amused. With care, Henry had chosen a piece of cream, laid writing paper, folded it once, and in his neat but unpracticed hand invited her to call on his sister the following Thursday. There was no overt sentiment in the note. Propriety would not allow such a thing so soon. But as he sealed the envelope with red wax, he could not help imagining her opening it. When Eleanor received the letter 2 days later, the invitation came as no great surprise. In her world, polite acquaintances often extended such calls. Yet there was a certain care in the phrasing that caught her attention, a balance of formality and warmth. She set the letter aside, read it again that evening, and finally penned a short, gracious acceptance. So began an exchange that would grow into a quiet correspondence, each letter carrying the courtship forward by careful increments. Henry, whose work kept him at a desk from 9 until dusk, came to rely on the ritual of writing after supper. He described walks along the embankment, the changing display in a bookseller's window, the small victories and frustrations of office life. Eleanor, whose days were filled with household visits and charitable committees, replied with descriptions of her reading, the music played at a recent soiree, and the progress of the garden at her family's house in Clapham. The rhythm of their letters fell into place, his posted on Wednesday and Saturday mornings, hers arriving on Monday and Thursday afternoons. The knowledge of these fixed days gave their week a shared structure, a small calendar of expectation. Yet the post was not infallible. There were mornings when Henry's letter failed to arrive, delayed perhaps by a missed connection at the railway or the misdirection of a bag. On such days, Eleanor would feel a faint disquiet, as though the absence of ink on paper meant the absence of thought. Henry, too, found himself restless when Thursday passed without the familiar cream envelope on his desk. But these lapses only sharpened their anticipation for the next delivery. Over months, the tone of their letters shifted. Formalities gave way to gentle confidences, the book that had moved her to tears, the recollection of a seaside holiday from his boyhood. They began to speak of shared hopes, not directly, not in so many words, but through hints and images. A description of a garden path Eleanor particularly loved was answered by Henry's remark that he hoped one day to see it for himself. By autumn, the space between their letters was filled with an unspoken understanding. When Henry finally enclosed, within his customary folded sheet, a smaller envelope addressed in his own hand, and inside it, a proposal written plainly but with sincerity, Eleanor did not hesitate in her reply. Her acceptance reached him in 2 days. The moment he read it, the long months of waiting and writing seemed to collapse into a single instant of certainty. Yet even after their engagement, they continued to write, as if the habit had woven itself into the fabric of their days. In this way, the Victorian postal service did more than deliver words. It carried forward entire relationships, sustaining them with a measured pace that allowed thought to deepen between each exchange. Today, in a world of instantaneous communication, it is difficult to imagine the deliberate patience of such courtships. Perhaps the question worth asking is not whether modern love could survive at the speed of the post, but whether it might, in slowing, discover something that has quietly been lost. In the London of the late 14th century, when the city's population hovered around 40,000, and the Thames was still the main artery of commerce, marriage among the families of the guilds was never a matter of mere romance. It was, more often than not, a carefully measured agreement, an arrangement in which the exchange of goods, skills, and influence outweighed the exchange of whispered affections. The guilds themselves were not simply trade associations. They were powerful bodies that regulated every aspect of a craft. The Worshipful Company of Mercers, for example, oversaw the city's most lucrative textile trade, controlling the quality of imported silks and fine cloth. The grocers monitored the spice trade, from peppercorns brought in from the Levant to sacks of cinnamon and cloves arriving through Venetian intermediaries. Bakers, vintners, goldsmiths, each had their own charter, their own hall, and, importantly, their own web of family alliances. Within this world, a marriage could consolidate commercial networks as surely as a merger might today. The son of a successful vintner might be matched to the daughter of a prominent fishmonger, not because their trades overlapped directly, but because their combined contacts across the docks and warehouses could influence which ships were unloaded first, which goods reached market at peak value, and which merchants received favourable credit. These arrangements did not begin at the altar. They began in the quiet, private chambers of guild halls after a meeting had adjourned, or in the shaded corners of a churchyard after Mass. Two men, perhaps a master goldsmith and a prosperous draper, might lean close over a ledger, murmuring about dowries, apprenticeships, and property leases. The conversation might be as much about barrels of alum or the price of imported tin as about the young people in question. For the families themselves, Marriage negotiations were layered with unspoken rules. Dowries were central, not simply as a payment, but as a declaration of standing. A wealthy Tullow chandler might offer a dowry in silver coin, while a vintner could pledge a cask of imported wine to mark the union. In some cases, guild families promised apprenticeships within their trade as part of the agreement, ensuring that a son-in-law would be trained in the family's craft. For the young people, the process could feel distant. A young woman of a mercer's household might hear whispers from her mother about a possible match, but receive no formal word until months later. A son might be introduced to his future wife in the hall of her father's home, the meeting conducted under the watchful eyes of both families. The language used in such meetings was polite, restrained, and pointedly indirect. Affection, if it was to grow, would do so in the margins, in small glances exchanged during guild feasts or Corpus Christi processions. Feasts, in fact, played a subtle but important role in matchmaking. Guild banquets, with their long tables set beneath the banners of each craft, offered the chance for young men and women to be seen, not in isolation, but as part of the wealth and dignity of their family's trade. The wine flowed, the roasted meats were carved in generous portions, and between the courses, there was time for measured conversation. A young man who could speak knowledgeably about trade routes or the virtues of Flemish cloth might leave a favorable impression on a potential father-in-law. The church also served as a stage for such alliances. On saints' days, guild members processed through the streets in full livery, their families walking behind them, observing the order of the procession, who walked nearest to whom, whose banners were carried side by side, could offer a keen observer clues about which families were in quiet talks. In some cases, matchmaking was as much about location as about trade. Property in London was tightly held, and marriage could be a means of securing a house or shop in a favourable part of the city. A goldsmith with a shop in Cheapside might be eager to connect his family to a haberdasher with frontage on Cornhill, giving both parties a foothold in two bustling commercial centres. Yet, for all its calculated nature, not every guild marriage was cold. Once an agreement was settled, and the contract signed, couples sometimes found in each other a companion who understood the rhythm of their trade. A vintner's wife might be as skilled in judging a barrel of claret as her husband, and a fishmonger's husband might learn to read the tides from his wife's long experience on the wharves. Shared labour, in many cases, was the soil from which affection slowly took root. Still, in the first stage, the negotiations, the personal was firmly bound to the economic. The question was rarely, do they suit one another, but rather, do their households, their apprenticeships, their credit, and their connections suit? And as the bells of St. Paul's marked the passing hours over the city, the quiet matchmaking of London's guild families continued, not in love letters or secret meetings, but in ledgers, feast-seating arrangements, and the discreet murmur of fathers at the close of a guild hall meeting. It is in these small, carefully arranged alliances that we can see how marriage, in medieval London, was less a private affair than a deliberate act of trade policy. But if this was only the beginning, what happened when negotiations gave way to betrothals, and betrothals to the public spectacle of a guild wedding? Once the long negotiations were complete, dowries agreed, property rights secured, and mutual obligations set down in neat, inked clauses, the private agreement between two guild families would step, cautiously, into the public eye. This was the betrothal, a formal promise to marry that carried legal and social weight. In many cases, the betrothal took place not in a church, but in the guild hall of one of the families. The long oak table would be cleared of ledgers and measuring weights, polished until it reflected the light from the leaded windows. The fathers would sit at the head, the mothers to one side, and the young couple at the far end, like junior partners waiting for the official handshake. The priest, sometimes from the couple's parish, sometimes chosen for his friendly ties to both families, would oversee the exchange of vows. These were not the vows of the wedding itself, but they were binding in the eyes of both canon law and civic custom. The young man might place a token ring on his betrothed's hand, often of silver rather than gold, or he might present a symbolic gift tied to his trade, a spool of fine silk, a small piece of polished jet, or a jar of imported saffron. Once the betrothal was made public, it became a matter of community knowledge. London was a city of close quarters, and news travelled not by printed announcements, but through the busy hum of markets, alehouses, and churchyards. Women gossiping at the pump might discuss the match, speculating on whether the bride's dowry would include the coveted corner shop on Bread Street, or whether the groom's father had promised apprenticeships to his new in-laws' nephews. The betrothal also allowed time for the more visible preparations. Wedding garments were a significant expense and a point of pride for guild families. A mercer's daughter might wear a gown of imported velvet dyed in deep, costly reds, while a goldsmith's son might have his doublet lined with fur to show prosperity. The fabric, more than the cut, was the display of wealth. For in a city where sumptuary laws limited certain colours and materials to the upper ranks, a guild member's right to wear a particular cloth was both legal privilege and public statement. Invitations were not written but delivered in person, often by a younger sibling, or an apprentice sent to the homes of fellow guild members and family friends. These visits served two purposes: to extend the welcome and to subtly announce the scale of the event. A brief mention of the number of barrels of wine being brought in from the vintner's cellar, or the fact that the fishmongers were supplying fresh sturgeon from the Thames estuary, let guests know they could expect a feast of note. The wedding day itself began early, often with a procession from the bride's home to the parish church. The guild banners might be carried ahead, their bright colours snapping in the morning breeze, followed by musicians playing shawms and drums. Behind them, the families walked in ordered ranks, with the bride and groom in the centre. Children of the guild, apprentices in clean tunics, daughters of members in bright ribbons, lined the route, tossing herbs and petals. Inside the church, the vows were exchanged with the solemnity expected of a sacrament. Yet the true spectacle, the part most talked about afterwards, was the feast that followed. Guild weddings were an opportunity to reaffirm alliances before the wider community, and the seating arrangements spoke as loudly as the menu. Those closest to the head table were allies or families of whom future matches might be made. Those further down the board, perhaps respected but less influential members, were still within the glow of the occasion, but at a respectful remove. The food was abundant and carefully chosen. Dishes reflected not only the family's means, but also their trade connections. A vintner's feast might offer imported wines from Gascony alongside roasted goose and almond tarts. A mercer's table could feature delicate sugar confections from Italy, shaped into miniature castles or ships. Every bite, every display of colour and texture, was part of the social message this family was prosperous, well-connected, and worthy of respect. As the day waned and the candles were lit, there might be dancing, though in the dignified style expected of the guild elite. Partners would step slowly in time to the music, careful not to disturb the heavy embroidery on their sleeves. Conversation would drift between trade news, parish matters, and gentle speculation about which young people might be the next to make a match. By the end of the evening, when the last guests departed and the wine jugs were drained, the marriage had not only united two individuals, but had subtly reshaped the web of London's mercantile alliances. Property, apprenticeships, and trade favours would flow differently now, and in a city where the fortunes of a family could rise or fall with a single ship's cargo, such changes were quietly significant. The wedding feast might have ended, but the true test lay ahead, in the day-to-day partnership of a married couple bound by both affection and the practical demands of their trade. Marriage among London's medieval guild families was never purely a private matter. The union might begin with vows in a quiet church and a feast that brought together relatives, allies, and fellow craftsmen, but the day after the celebrations, life settled quickly into its steady, work-bound rhythm. A guild household was a business as much as a home. The front rooms often doubled as the shop or workshop, with windows open to the street so customers could view goods, hear the hammering of metal, or smell the warming spice of fresh bread. The rear rooms, smaller and dimmer, housed the family's private life. A dining space, perhaps a small parlour, and sleeping chambers upstairs. The new wife's role began immediately. If she had grown up in a guild family herself, she would already know the cadence of the trade when deliveries arrived, how to greet regular customers, how to balance the household accounts alongside the shop's ledgers. She might rise early to oversee apprentices sweeping the shop floor, or to check that the fabrics displayed in the morning light were uncreased and bright. For the husband, work might mean hours at the workbench, engraving a piece of silver, planing timber for a merchant's chest, or weighing out a batch of saffron from a fresh shipment. The wife's work was less visible but no less essential. She might negotiate with suppliers, discreetly noting which families were in good financial health and which might be delaying payments. She often managed the household servants, ensuring that meals were prepared and beds made, while also keeping the shop running smoothly. Guild marriages were partnerships in the truest sense. In the husband's absence, perhaps while travelling to trade fairs in York or Calais, the wife could conduct sales, oversee apprentices, and even sign contracts. In fact, surviving records from the 14th and 15th centuries show numerous examples of wifing as their husbands' legal representatives, sealing deals with their own hands. Beyond the walls of their home and shop, guild couples were part of a carefully watched community. Neighbours noticed who kept their accounts tidy, who paid their guild dues promptly, and who let their shutters fall into disrepair. A successful marriage, then, was also a form of public display. A tidy shop, a well-fed household, and polite but steady engagement in parish and guild matters. Yet there was space, in these marriages, for affection and familiarity. Many couples grew up knowing each other, sometimes even sharing a childhood in the same parish. Letters and account books occasionally carry the faintest traces of humour. A playful note in the margin, a jest tucked between lists of debts. Evenings might be spent by the fire, the wife mending garments, while the husband recounted news from the docks, or the pair quietly calculating whether this year's profits could stretch to a bolt of new cloth for the children's winter cloaks. The year moved in a cycle of both business and domestic rituals. There was Lent, when luxury goods sold more slowly and household meals grew plainer. There was summer, when imported cloth and spices arrived in greater volume, and there was the annual guild feast, where couples appeared in their finest, greeting allies and subtly promoting their wares through casual conversation. In time, the marriage might grow into something deeper than the practical alliance it began as. Shared work, shared burdens, and the unspoken understanding that both fortunes and hardships were weathered together created bonds not easily broken. And if the match had been carefully chosen in the first place, affection often followed. Not the fiery passion of a troubadour's ballad, but the steady warmth of companionship, trust, and mutual respect. As the years passed, children would be drawn into the same rhythm, learning the trade from both parents. Sons might follow their fathers into the guild, daughters often married into other guild families, weaving the mercantile web tighter still, and so the cycle continued, each marriage forming one thread in the fabric of London's commercial and social life. In the end, the love stories of London's guild families were measured not in sonnets or whispered scandal, but in ledgers balanced, shutters opened each morning, and the quiet knowledge that, together, they had kept their household and their place in the city secure. In the early 1700s, London's coffee houses were not merely places to drink coffee. They were hubs of conversation, commerce, and, on occasion, courtship. By the time a young gentleman or lady stepped into one, the coffee house had already been transformed from a foreign novelty into an institution, a kind of public sitting room where news, gossip, and ideas mingled with the fragrant steam rising from small porcelain cups. The first thing one noticed was the sound. Not the clattering noise of a tavern, but the layered murmur of many voices, debating politics, discussing the latest pamphlet, or exchanging whispers about a merchant's fortunes. Wooden chairs scraped the floor as patrons shifted to greet acquaintances or to make space at a crowded table. Coffee was served in small portions, but it was strong and bitter, often sweetened with sugar from the West Indies. These establishments were open to a broad range of visitors, though social codes still lingered. Some houses catered to merchants and traders, others to literary men, and a few to the more fashionable circles who used them as meeting places before theatre outings or carriage rides through St. James's Park. The rarer sight of a lady entering a coffee house caused heads to turn, not necessarily in disapproval, but in curiosity, in certain venues. Particularly those known for literary gatherings. Women were welcomed if they carried themselves with confidence and were prepared to join the flow of conversation. Courtship in this setting was never obvious. A gentleman might begin with a polite inquiry about the latest political satire, or offer a newspaper to a lady whose gloved hands rested idly on the table. The exchange of books or pamphlets became an excuse for further conversation. A cup of coffee could stretch into an hour of measured talk, about poetry, about the weather along the Thames, or about the curious changes in city fashions. For some, these conversations were carefully calculated. A merchant's son might seek the acquaintance of a family whose influence could open doors in the city. A young widow might accept an introduction here, knowing the coffee house was a public space, respectable, yet informal enough to allow a private tone between two people seated in a quiet corner. Even the layout of the room encouraged subtle encounters. Narrow tables placed close together meant one could not help overhearing the next table's talk. A well-timed remark dropped into the conversation at an adjoining table might lead to an invitation to join. And from there, perhaps to further meetings in more private settings, such as a garden walk or a family supper. In this way, the coffee house was more than a place for caffeine and debate. It became, for those inclined toward romance, a stage where first impressions were formed over the rim of a small porcelain cup, and where alliances, both social and sentimental, could begin with nothing more than a shared interest in a new play or a foreign trade report. By the mid-18th century, London's coffee houses had developed a rhythm, a kind of social choreography, that was understood by their regular patrons. A man or woman who wished to use these spaces for more than idle conversation had to learn its silent language. Every gesture, from how one entered the room to where one chose to sit, could carry meaning. Entering was the first signal. The regulars noticed everything. The way a gentleman paused to remove his hat, the degree of polish on his boots, the freshness of his linen shirt. These small details told others who he was, or who he wished to be thought of as. A well-kept appearance implied stability and good manners, while excessive ornamentation could be read as vanity or an attempt to impress above one's station. Seating was the next step in the ritual. The most sought after positions were near the front windows, where one could watch the street and be seen by those passing. These tables often served as informal stages, and a man seated there with a newspaper might attract attention from newcomers scanning the room. By contrast, the back tables offered more privacy, their shadows favored by those engaged in discreet or tender conversation. Once seated, the act of ordering coffee itself could be part of the exchange. A gentleman might instruct the waiter to bring a second cup without being asked, sliding it toward a lady with a slight nod, an offer both literal and symbolic. In some houses, it was common to add a small plate of sweetmeats or a slice of cake, a gesture hinting at generosity and taste. Conversation had its own rules. Overt declarations of romantic interest were frowned upon. The tone was light, measured, and safely couched in talk of plays, travel, or books. A gentleman might ask a lady's opinion on a poem in the latest gentleman's magazine, listening carefully not just to her words, but to the way she held her cup or met his gaze. If she lingered over her reply, smiled faintly, or leaned forward even slightly, these were signs worth noting. The exchange of printed material was a favoured device. A lady might bring a small volume of verse, placing it on the table as if by chance. If the gentleman asked to borrow it, she could write her name neatly inside the cover, ensuring it would have to be returned. an excuse for another meeting. In the same way, a gentleman might pass along a political pamphlet, his own brief comments scribbled in the margins, inviting her thoughts. Even the act of leaving carried weight. Rising too abruptly could suggest disinterest. Lingering at the table, even after the coffee was gone, might be read as encouragement. In some cases, the departure was timed so that both parties could step into the street together, allowing a short walk before their ways parted. A small bridge between the public setting of the coffee house and the more private spaces of personal acquaintance. In such ways, romance in London's coffee houses unfolded not in passionate speeches or dramatic gestures, but in slow, deliberate steps, an art as much about observation as conversation. Each rule, though unwritten, was observed with the same care one might give to the brewing of the coffee itself, patient, precise, and best enjoyed without haste. If you linger in the old quarters of London long enough, you may still find the faint outlines of former coffee houses. The faded lettering above a narrow shop front, the uneven wooden beams of a ceiling that once sheltered the low hum of conversation. It is in these spaces, more than any written record, that the lives of long-ago couples still echo. Not all courtships begun over a steaming dish of coffee ended in marriage, of course. Many were simply pleasant diversions, a few weeks of measured exchanges and carefully weighed glances before one or both parties drifted away. But for those that endured, the moment when a coffee house courtship stepped beyond its familiar four walls was almost always marked by a careful negotiation of family, propriety, and timing. Proposals in the 18th century London sense were rarely sudden affairs. The coffee house had provided a public setting in which two people might become aware of one another, but the real test came afterward, when introductions were made to parents or guardians. In more conservative families, a gentleman might have to make his intentions known in writing before any private meeting was sanctioned. Such letters were often polite to the point of stiffness, a contrast to the lighter tones of coffee-house banter. Still, the setting in which the courtship began was often remembered fondly. There are accounts, preserved in family papers, of couples who chose to walk past their coffee house together on the day of their engagement, pausing to recall the exact table where they first spoke. In some cases, a small token, a coffee spoon, a printed menu, even a fragment of a porcelain cup, was kept as a memento, wrapped in paper and stored away. Marriage announcements in the newspapers occasionally made coy reference to these origins. A line might read, "The acquaintance, first formed in agreeable company at the Grecian Coffee House, has now been blessed with the happiest of conclusions." For those who knew the couple, this was enough to conjure images of the early days, the steam rising from the cups, the rustle of newspapers, the murmur of voices. Yet even among the marriages that sprang from such beginnings, the coffee house often remained a thread woven through the years. Some couples returned together as husband and wife, though their visits became rarer as domestic life claimed more of their time. Others, particularly those of literary or political inclinations, continued to meet friends there, the tables serving as a familiar backdrop to the changing patterns of their lives. It is tempting to imagine that the taste of coffee itself, bitter, aromatic, and slow to cool, mirrored the nature of these relationships, requiring patience, rewarding attention, and offering a warmth that lingered. The romances that began here were rarely the stuff of plays or novels. They were quieter, steadier, anchored in shared conversations and the unspoken comfort of each other's company. And when the coffee houses themselves began to wane in number, giving way to clubs, tea rooms, and other social spaces, the memories they held did not vanish entirely. They simply shifted into the private realm of family stories, told to children and grandchildren, who might smile at the notion of love beginning over something as ordinary as a cup of coffee. Perhaps that is the quiet legacy of these places, not their role in politics or business, as history so often records, but the countless, unremarkable beginnings they nurtured. Moments when two lives crossed in the warm, fragrant air of a London coffee house, and did not part again. In the long stretch of the 17th and 18th centuries, when sails were the quickest wings a human could command, love like cargo, often travelled slowly. A young man might stand on a dock in Bristol or Portsmouth, letter folded neatly in his pocket, knowing it would be weeks before the words reached the person for whom they were meant. The sea, vast and unpredictable, would lie between their ink and its intended reader. Courtship in this age had its own peculiar rhythm, dictated not by the heart's impatience, but by the schedules of merchant ships, naval voyages, and the tides themselves. Letters were precious and deliberate. The language chosen with care, for each sentence might be the only communication between two people for many months. There was no casual, "I'll write again tomorrow." Paper was scarce, postage dear, and opportunity uncertain. Seaside towns developed their own quiet rituals around this kind of long-distance affection. A captain might agree to carry personal letters as a favour, tucking them into a safe corner of his cabin. Port officials sometimes acted as intermediaries, holding a small box of mail until the recipient arrived to claim it. When letters finally came, they were opened slowly, as though savouring the mere fact of their arrival before reading the words themselves. Young women, especially those connected to merchant or naval families, often became adept at reading between the lines of such correspondence. A brief mention of weather might conceal worry over a dangerous crossing. A note about a delayed cargo could hint at financial strain. And, woven through it all, there was often a careful politeness, the formality of the time making open declarations of love rare, yet all the more meaningful when they appeared. The delays shaped the nature of the relationships. A quarrel could not be resolved in hours or days. By the time a reply arrived, tempers had cooled or affections had changed. In some cases, a romance deepened precisely because of this distance, the absence giving weight to every phrase, every promise. In others, the long silences proved too heavy, and the bond loosened until it faded entirely. There was, too, the quiet uncertainty of the sea itself. Not every letter reached its destination. Ships sank, storms scattered cargo and crew. On more than one occasion, a love letter was found in the possession of someone it was never meant for, retrieved from a wreck, or washed ashore in a battered chest. The knowledge of such risks made the arrival of each letter almost miraculous, and yet, despite the hazards and the slow pace these sea-crossing courtships endured, they became a familiar thread in port towns, part of the fabric of life alongside the smell of tar and rope, the calls of gulls, and the sight of sails shrinking into the horizon. For the couples themselves, the long waits became part of their shared story, a reminder that their affection had been tested by time and tide, and had, somehow, survived. In the archives of the British Library, tucked among boxes of faded ledgers and bound volumes of naval records, there is a small bundle of letters tied together with blue ribbon. The paper is browned at the edges, the ink softened by time. They belong to a woman named Margaret Prowse, whose fiancé, Thomas Vale, served as a junior officer on a merchant vessel trading between London and the West Indies in the late 1760s. Margaret's letters to Thomas are formal in greeting, "My dearest sir," but warm beneath the surface. She writes of her mother's failing eyesight, of the changing prices at the local market, and of the parish gossip about a neighbour's runaway dog. But threaded through the ordinary details are small phrases that Thomas would have known were meant only for him. "I hope this reaches you before the rains," or "May the trade winds keep you in my thoughts as they carry you home." Thomas's replies, sent months later, are equally careful. He writes of the ship's progress, of delays caused by cargo disputes in Kingston, of the oppressive heat in the tropics. And, once in a while, a sentence slips in that breaks the formality. "The night watch is long, but I keep company with the thought of your voice." The gap between letters was sometimes so great that events described in one had already changed by the time the other read them. Margaret's letter about a family wedding might arrive after the couple had already welcomed their first child. A mention of a neighbour's illness might be answered long after the neighbour had recovered. This constant time lag gave their correspondence a strange double life, half history, half present. They were not unique. The journals of a certain Captain Edmund Searle, who sailed between London and Calcutta, mention more than once that his wife, Eliza, wrote to him on the first of every month without fail, knowing that not all would arrive, but that some might. He describes carrying her unopened letters with him for weeks, until he reached a safe anchorage, then reading them all in one sitting by lantern light. It is like hearing her speak across oceans, he wrote in 1792, and though the words are old, they are new to me. For many such couples, a network of intermediaries sustained the romance. Friends in port cities acted as relay points, holding on to letters until a trustworthy captain could carry them on. Some merchants allowed their ship's clerks to keep a private pouch for crew members' correspondence, separate from the cargo manifests. In rare cases, two ships traveling in opposite directions might meet mid-ocean, exchange greetings, and swap bundles of mail. These, sea post offices, were celebrated events for those waiting on news. The style of writing itself adapted to the pace. Sentences were longer, descriptions fuller, because the writer could not rely on another chance soon. It was common to include multiple questions in a single letter, knowing that the answers might come months later, or not at all. Love, in this form, was a slow craft, shaped by patience and persistence. Still, there were moments of heartbreak. The London Chronicle of 1783 records the story of a young woman in Deptford who continued writing to her betrothed for 3 years, unaware that his ship had been lost with all hands. Only when a fellow sailor returned on another vessel did she learn the truth. Her letters, bundled in her fiancé's sea chest, had gone down with him. Yet for others, the endurance of this postal courtship became the foundation for lifelong bonds. The long silences were not empty, they were filled with imagined conversations, with the mental rehearsal of the reunion to come. When it finally arrived, a ship's mast appearing on the horizon, the slow disembarkation. The first words spoken face to face after years, it was as if the letters had built a bridge strong enough to hold the weight of the moment. And always, there remained the knowledge that love across the sea was not a matter of quick exchanges or impulsive decisions. It was measured in tides, in trade winds, in the careful folding of paper and sealing of wax. Those who lived it knew that affection, like a good ship, needed maintenance, skill, and the patience to weather long voyages. When a ship carrying a long-awaited fiancé or husband finally moored in the Thames, the news often travelled faster than the ship could unload. Boys on the wharves would run ahead shouting the vessel's name, and within an hour, women in nearby parishes might be seen hurrying toward the docks, their skirts gathering soot and river mud. The reunions themselves were rarely the grand, sweeping embraces imagined in novels. There were formalities, the captain's report, the customs inspection, the sorting of baggage, that kept families waiting within sight of their loved ones for hours. A woman might watch her husband from the quay, as he conferred with the ship's purser, smiling only when their eyes met briefly over the heads of dock workers. When the first quiet moment came, it was often awkward. Months or years of carefully composed letters had given the couple time to think of the perfect phrasing, the ideal sentiment. Now, face to face, the words might come haltingly. Many couples later wrote that their first conversation ashore was about the weather. It was as though they had to relearn the rhythm of speaking without ink and paper between them. For Margaret Prowse and Thomas Vale, the meeting came on a bright June afternoon in 1770. Thomas had returned from his final voyage before taking up a position with a London trading house. Margaret's diary entry for that day contains just one line: "He is home, and he smiled at me as if no time had passed." They married within the month. Some found that distance had quietly altered them. Captain Edmund Searle's journal notes that his wife, Eliza, spoke with more confidence than when I left her, and that he himself felt slower to argue, after so long relying on her detailed letters for news. The postal courtship had shaped not only their affection, but their temperaments. Marriages formed after such long separations tended to be deliberate affairs. These were not impulsive matches. The months between each letter gave both parties time to reflect, to decide if their affection was built on more than the novelty of absence. As a result, many unions proved steady, with disputes handled in the same measured tone that had been honed by years of slow correspondence. Yet the romance of letter writing never fully disappeared. Even after settling into life ashore, some couples kept the habit. Margaret and Thomas, though living in the same house, would sometimes leave small notes for one another in the kitchen or by the hearth, not out of necessity, but out of fondness for the form. Others found that the sea would call again. Husbands might return to service after a few years at home. Wives would once again prepare bundles of letters, and the cycle of waiting and reunion would repeat. For these couples, love was not something that ended with the closing of a distance. It was a skill, practiced and maintained, whether apart or together. By the close of the 18th century, the London docks had seen thousands of such reunions. Most were unremarkable to passers-by. A handshake, a small laugh, a couple walking slowly home together. But within those quiet moments was a history written not only in ink, but in patience, the story of people who learned to sustain affection across oceans, with nothing more than a quill, a sheet of paper, and the faith that their words would someday find their way to the right hands. In 18th century London, courtship was not a whirlwind of stolen glances in public gardens or dramatic balcony scenes under the moon. Instead, for many respectable families, it was a carefully managed affair, quite literally, often conducted indoors, under the dim and flickering light of tallow candles. The scene you might picture is not one of passionate embraces or whispered declarations, but rather a polite and faintly awkward arrangement of chairs in the family's front room. The suitor seated rigidly, the young woman poised in her best dress, and at least one chaperone quietly knitting in the corner. Evening visits were the most respectable, and for many, the only sanctioned way for a suitor to spend time with a young lady of good standing. They were arranged with a level of precision that reflected the importance of both propriety and appearances in this society. Invitations to these visits might be extended directly by the family or hinted at through mutual acquaintances. A gentleman could not simply arrive unannounced. Doing so would be considered either absurdly forward or suspiciously desperate. The idea was to balance formality with the faint possibility of personal connection, a subtle dance in which every gesture carried meaning. The timing of these visits was important. Evening meant after the day's work was concluded, but not so late that the visit risked implying impropriety. In most respectable households, a courting call would begin between 6 and 8 o'clock in the evening. Candles would be lit, not merely for illumination, but also to create a particular atmosphere. For wealthier families, beeswax candles might be used, casting a warmer glow and a finer scent than the smoky, greasy light of cheaper tallow. The glow of the room, coupled with the stillness of the evening, created a kind of intimacy, though one frequently counteracted by the steady, watchful presence of relatives. It is important to note that 18th century candlelight was not the romantic lighting we imagine today from novels or period dramas. Candles gave off a surprisingly poor, often uneven light, with shadows that danced and shifted as the flame wavered. For a suitor, this might mean that the young lady's expression was occasionally hidden or obscured. For the young lady, it might mean that the gentleman's face appeared alternately striking and unflatteringly gaunt. Conversation had to fill these moments when the visual was uncertain. Conversation, in fact, was the central element of courting by candlelight. Without music to speak of, unless the young lady played a harpsichord, which could be used as a genteel interlude, and with little privacy, the exchange of words became the main stage upon which romance might be built or quietly dismantled. Topics were expected to be light, safe, and revealing only in the gentlest way: books, recently read, mutual acquaintances, the latest events in the city, or the weather's effect on travel. Direct declarations of affection were rare in these early stages, replaced instead by attentive listening and well-timed compliments. The suitor's behavior during these visits was quietly assessed, not just by the young woman, but by her family. Did he remove his hat promptly upon entering? Did he rise when the lady entered the room? Did he speak with an easy, measured tone, showing he could manage a household conversation without dominating it? These were small measures, but in the eyes of many parents, They spoke louder than any love letter. The ability to sit in a candlelit parlour without fidgeting, to speak without arrogance, and to leave precisely at the socially acceptable time were all part of the unspoken tests. Of course, there was one aspect of candlelit courting that added both charm and frustration: the subtle possibilities afforded by shadow. A glance held a little longer than necessary might pass unnoticed by the chaperone, lost in the flicker of the flame. A hand offered to help the lady adjust her shawl might briefly meet hers without comment. These tiny, almost imperceptible exchanges were, for many couples, the most exciting part of the visit, and yet they were so fleeting that one could leave the house at the end of the evening unsure whether anything meaningful had occurred at all. Still, there was something about the candlelight that lent itself to daydreaming. The wavering glow, the occasional sputter of a wick, the quiet hum of the household around them. It all suggested a slower, more deliberate pace of romance. But it also meant that relationships developed over months, even years, of such visits, with each evening's progress measured not in bold moves, but in the accumulation of countless small impressions. This was courtship as it was lived by much of London's middle and upper classes in the 18th century, a series of carefully orchestrated meetings in which romance had to grow within the strict boundaries of etiquette, dim lighting, and limited opportunity for private conversation. It was, in many ways, a trial of patience as much as it was an exploration of affection. But as the century progressed, something began to change, not in the rules of propriety themselves, but in the spaces where these evening visits could occur. And, with those changes, the candlelit parlour would find itself sharing the role of romance's stage with other, more public places. By the middle of the 18th century, the tradition of evening visits in the family parlour was still firmly in place, but London itself was changing in ways that quietly reshaped how courtship played out. The city was growing, both in size and in population. Streets were becoming better lit with oil lamps, coffee houses were multiplying, and new social venues, assembly rooms, pleasure gardens, and theatres, offered opportunities for couples to be seen in public without scandal. These shifts didn't replace the candlelit drawing room entirely, but they did begin to give courting couples an alternative to the tightly supervised parlour. Families of the old school often looked upon these new venues with suspicion. A public setting might mean more freedom, but it also meant less control over what a young lady saw and heard. The parlour visit, with its measured pace and ever-watchful chaperone, still carried the advantage of predictability. A young man's manners could be observed in a controlled environment, his conversation monitored, and his ability to endure long stretches of small talk thoroughly tested. Still, even in the safety of the home, small accommodations to modern life crept in. For instance, the growth of the postal system and the rise of printed materials meant that a suitor might bring along the latest newspaper or pamphlet as a topic of discussion. This served two purposes. It provided a safe, neutral subject when conversation lagged, and it also suggested that the suitor was well informed, a valuable trait for a future husband expected to manage property and business affairs. The exchange might be as unromantic as comparing the price of imported tea, but in the coded world of polite society, it was still a kind of progress. The furniture of the evening visit was another subtle but important factor. Wealthier families began to invest in more comfortable seating arrangements, with cushioned armchairs or small settees placed near the fireplace. Though this offered little in the way of true privacy, it did make the experience less stiff and more conducive to extended conversation. In smaller or less prosperous homes, seating was still arranged to keep the suitor a safe and respectable distance from the young lady. An arrangement reinforced by the flicker of candlelight, which could make the space feel at once more intimate and more constrained. Yet, the candle itself was slowly becoming a symbol of a certain kind of old-fashioned courtship. In wealthier districts, oil lamps, or even early argon lamps, began to appear indoors, offering a steadier and brighter light. This change had an unexpected effect. Brighter lighting made prolonged eye contact and small gestures harder to disguise. Couples who had grown used to the soft shadows of candlelight sometimes found the unblinking brightness of these newer lamps unsettling. The candle's uneven glow, once merely a product of necessity, was now understood to have been a kind of unintentional ally to young romance. The pace of these visits was never rushed. Even as London's public entertainments expanded, the formal evening call remained an almost ritualized event. The suitor would arrive punctually, exchange polite greetings, and spend an hour or two in the company of the young lady and her family. Refreshments, often no more than tea and small cakes, might be served, though in more modest households, even this was a luxury. As the hour approached 9 or 10 o'clock, the suitor was expected to take his leave, rising to bow politely before putting on his coat and hat. For some couples, these visits were the slow cultivation of a future marriage. For others, they were a quiet test of endurance, measured less in romance than in the ability to sustain conversation in a room where every word was heard by at least one other person. A spark might grow from such encounters, but it would be a small, carefully tended spark, one that required many return visits before it could be fanned into anything more substantial. Still, even as the century neared its end, there remained something stubbornly enduring about the candlelit courtship. It was safe. It was respectable. And for many, it was the only acceptable way to bridge the gap between two families. Public life might be expanding, but the flickering parlour remained the place where intentions were declared, or politely declined. And yet, as the 19th century approached, the expansion of public spaces and the slow relaxation of certain social rules would bring the private and public worlds of romance closer together. Evening visits would not vanish, but their role would begin to shift. By the dawn of the 19th century, the candlelit evening visit was no longer the unchallenged centerpiece of London courtship. The Industrial Revolution had begun to change the very rhythm of life, and with it, the way young people met, conversed, and judged one another's suitability. Street lighting improved dramatically. The once patchy glow of oil lamps was replaced by brighter, more reliable illumination, making nighttime walks safer and more socially acceptable. Couples could stroll arm in arm through well-lit squares or along the edges of newly fashionable parks. This small freedom was significant for the first time. Romantic encounters could be both public and respectable, without the constant shadow of a chaperone lurking at the far end of the parlour. The growing availability of public entertainment also chipped away at the dominance of home-based courtship. Theatres, music halls, and pleasure gardens like Vauxhall offered a mixture of excitement and propriety, so long as a young lady was accompanied by a trusted family member or friend. Here, under strings of glowing lanterns and the soft sound of distant orchestras, couples could exchange glances and murmured remarks that would have been unthinkable under the unblinking eye of a parlour full of relatives. Meanwhile, technological changes were creeping into domestic life. Candles were slowly giving way to oil lamps, and, eventually, to gaslight in wealthier homes. While this made reading and sewing easier in the evenings, it subtly altered the mood of courtship. Gaslight revealed every detail of a face, every crease in a coat, every nervous twitch of a hand. Some found this honesty refreshing, others missed the gentle illusions offered by flickering candlelight. But perhaps the most decisive shift was in attitude. As the century progressed, marriage was still bound by property, status, and family alliance, but personal compatibility began to matter more, at least in the polite rhetoric of the day. Romantic novels, serialized stories in magazines, and even the sentimental stage plays of the period encouraged the notion that mutual affection was worth pursuing. The idea that a young man and woman might choose one another based on shared interests or an unspoken connection, even if still carefully supervised, was beginning to take root. Still, the old ways lingered. In quieter neighbourhoods and among more traditional families, the candlelit parlour visit continued well into the 1800s. The process was unchanged: the polite knock at the door, the stiffly formal greetings, the carefully measured conversation, and finally the ritual of departure, as the suitor stepped back into the lamplit street with hat in hand. For all its formality, there was a kind of comfort in the predictability of the evening visit. It was courtship as an orderly transaction, one in which the right families met under the right conditions, with no surprises and no scandals. And for some, the soft, uncertain glow of the candle was more than just a source of light. It was the last warm remnant of a world where love, if it came slowly, flickering into life in a quiet room on a winter's night. In the London of the 1700s, love moved at a pace that would feel almost impossible today. There was no instant messaging, no way to deliver your feelings across a city in seconds. Instead, romance often began with a letter, carefully composed, folded in a precise manner, and sealed with a drop of hot wax pressed by a personal seal. That seal was more than decoration. It was a quiet promise of authenticity. In a world where handwriting was as distinctive as a face, and where paper carried not only ink, but the faint scent of the room in which it was written, each letter was as much an object of affection as it was a message. The first challenge for a would-be suitor was simply how to begin. This was an age when love was not spoken of in blunt terms. The language of courtship was threaded through with polite formalities, veiled metaphors, and sometimes entire paragraphs that never directly mentioned the word love at all. Instead, letters might open with inquiries after health, notes on the weather, or mention of a mutual acquaintance's dinner party. Details that seem trivial now, but which in their time carried the undercurrent of romantic intent. Paper itself was a statement. Cheaper varieties were coarse and speckled with imperfections. The finer grades, often imported from Holland or France, were smooth and cream-coloured, and bore delicate watermarks visible when held up to the light. A young man of means might select the finest paper. He could afford to signal not only his affection, but also his refinement. Ink, too, was chosen with care. The common iron gall ink, made from oak galls and iron salts, gave a deep, lasting black, but it could corrode paper over decades. More refined households sometimes favoured imported inks in rich blues or browns, though such colours were rare in everyday correspondence. The act of sealing the letter was almost ceremonial. First, the page was folded into a neat packet, often without an envelope. For those were costly luxuries in England until later in the century. The suitor would light a candle, hold a stick of coloured sealing wax above the flame, and let a few molten drops fall onto the folded paper. Then, before the wax cooled, he pressed into it a signet ring or engraved seal. These seals bore initials, family crests, or symbolic designs. A dove for peace, a heart for affection, a classical column for steadfastness. A broken seal upon delivery was an unspoken scandal, for it hinted that someone had read what was not theirs to read. But before any of this could happen, there was the matter of delivery. In 18th century London, the postal system was both miraculous and maddening. Mail was carried by mounted postboys and foot messengers, and in the city itself by penny post carriers, who made several rounds a day. The problem was that postage was not paid by the sender, but by the recipient, and rates were calculated per sheet of paper, per distance travelled. To avoid excess cost, many people resorted to cross-writing, filling a page in one direction, then turning it 90 degrees and writing across the existing text, creating a dense lattice of words. To the modern eye, it's a puzzle. To the recipient, it was an intimate exercise in patience. Romantic letters, however, often disregarded economy. A lover might choose to write only on one side of the paper, so the handwriting remained uncluttered and pleasing to read. Such indulgence was a silent compliment. You are worth the extra postage. Responses could take days, sometimes weeks, depending on where the intended recipient lived. The wait was a test of both hope and anxiety. A delayed reply could mean many things: illness, travel, parental interference, or simply the slow pace of the post. For those separated by longer distances, each letter became a milestone, each seal broken with the mix of anticipation and nervousness that only distance can create. Yet, for all its slowness, the letter carried advantages over face-to-face conversation. In person, words might stumble. In writing, they could be perfected. The suitor could choose each phrase with care, shaping sentiment into graceful prose. And the recipient could return to those words again and again, rereading them by candlelight when the house was quiet. Letters were not just communications. They were objects to be cherished, tied with ribbon, tucked into drawers, and kept for decades. We might imagine an 18th century young woman, seated at a small walnut desk by her bedchamber window, unteeing a bundle of such letters. Perhaps she reads one from the spring past when the garden outside was still in bloom, and remembers how her heart had leapt at the first sight of that familiar handwriting. Each letter held its own season, its own moment, its own version of the relationship, captured in ink forever. But what happened when such letters fell into the wrong hands? What did society think of private correspondence between the unmarried, and what risks did both parties take by committing their feelings to paper? In 18th century Britain, a letter was not always a private exchange between two people. It was, instead, an object that might pass through several hands before reaching its destination. Postal clerks, servants, errand boys, and, in some cases, curious family members who considered themselves entitled to read it. The notion of privacy, particularly for unmarried women, was fragile. A letter from a man to a young lady could arouse suspicion, no matter how innocently worded. In more conservative households, all correspondence for a daughter might be inspected by a parent or an elder sibling before being delivered. Thus, those who engaged in romantic correspondence learned to write with a certain restraint. A letter could not be too forward, lest it compromise the writer's reputation or the recipient's honor. Instead, feelings were draped in layers of polite metaphor. The season grows colder, though my thoughts remain warm. Phrases which to the casual reader might seem purely descriptive, but to the intended recipient carried an unmistakable message. Some lovers developed private codes to evade prying eyes. A reference to the roses in the garden might signify a meeting at a particular hour. A mention of certain book might conceal the lending of a note hidden between its pages. Even the choice of ink color could hold meaning. Though black ink was standard, a rare dash of red might be a deliberate, if subtle, sign of ardor. Sealing wax played its own role in this quiet signaling. The color could be chosen for meaning: deep red for passion, pale blue for constancy, green for hope. A suitor might even vary his seal's emblem from time to time, using one crest for formal correspondence and another, more personal design, for intimate letters. These small choices added layers to a language of love understood only by two. Yet the risks remained real. In a society where marriage was as much an economic arrangement as a romantic one, a private letter could become evidence, either for or against a match. Parents could keep a letter to prove that an attachment existed, or, if they disapproved, to show that it was improper. A particularly unguarded phrase might be read aloud at a family table, its meaning twisted into ridicule. Even servants could be a threat. The maid who carried your message might be bribed to reveal its contents. Because of these dangers, some lovers avoided direct postal delivery altogether. They entrusted letters to mutual friends, sympathetic shopkeepers, or even tavern owners who acted as informal go-betweens. Others used the bustling London coffeehouses as meeting points, leaving letters under agreed upon names or symbols. This shadow network of couriers, willing or unwitting, kept many romances alive. The etiquette of replying was equally strict. A delayed answer could be interpreted as a cooling of affections, even if the delay was due to something as mundane as a missed post. Some young women, aware of the weight such silence carried, would hasten to send a brief note, no more than a line or two, assuring the suitor that a longer reply would follow. The careful management of time between letters was, in itself, an art of courtship. For all the rules and risks, there was a certain thrill in committing one's feelings to paper. A letter once sent could not be taken back. Its words, once read, could not be unheard. This permanence gave weight to the smallest turn of phrase, the lightest compliment, the gentlest wish for health and happiness. Each envelope, or folded packet, as was often the case, was a gamble, an offering, and a step forward in a slow dance that might take years to conclude. And when the conclusion came, whether in marriage, separation, or scandal, the letters often remained, bound together with ribbon or string, tucked into drawers or trunks. They might be read again decades later, their ink faded to brown, The paper soft with age, the wax seal brittle. In that way, the romance lingered long after the lovers themselves had grown old or gone. But for some, letters were not only for affection, they could also be tools of negotiation, even manipulation. And in 18th century London, when marriage markets were as calculated as stock exchanges, the romantic letter could serve purposes far beyond the beating of the heart. In 18th century London, love letters were not always a private indulgence between two sentimental souls. In the right or wrong circumstances, they could be deployed like a form of currency, small, paper tokens in the bustling marriage market of the city. While novels of the day might paint correspondence as purely a matter of the heart, the reality was that letters often held strategic value for entire families. A romantic letter, carefully preserved, could serve as proof of a suitor's intentions. In an era without engagement rings as formal symbols, a steady exchange of affectionate correspondence might be enough to convince a family that a match was serious. If a man later wavered, these letters could be produced as moral leverage, or in some cases, as grounds for legal action in breach of promise cases. In this way, a playful sentence penned in a moment of fondness could one day become part of courtroom evidence. Families on both sides understood the potential weight of the written word. Mothers, aunts, or elder sisters often read letters before they were sent, suggesting revisions to soften or sharpen a tone to hint at the right degree of enthusiasm without appearing desperate. Gentlemen were advised by older relatives to avoid overly extravagant language in early letters, lest they appear too eager and give the other party the upper hand in any marriage negotiations. For wealthier households, letters also served as discreet platforms for discussing matters that could not be spoken aloud at crowded assemblies or drawing rooms. A note might contain hints about a prospective dowry or subtle inquiries about the suitor's financial standing. These were rarely addressed directly. Instead, they were couched in careful metaphor, mention of a house well furnished or carriage well kept. Might not be about furniture or vehicles at all, but about the readiness of funds and resources for married life. The formality of the letter also offered a way to control the pace of courtship. A family might deliberately slow their replies to test a suitor's patience, or to give themselves more time to investigate his connections and income. On the other hand, an unusually swift reply could signal interest and encourage a proposal before competing suitors could intervene. Timing was a language all its own. Among the gentry, there was also a certain theatre to the presentation of a letter. A suitor's letter might arrive not merely folded and sealed, but scented faintly with lavender, its edges trimmed neatly, perhaps accompanied by a pressed flower. This was not only a gesture to the recipient, but also a silent statement to anyone else who might see it. Servants, companions, or curious relatives, that the sender had refinement, taste, and the means to afford such touches. Once a match was nearing agreement, letters became more openly practical. Where once they might have been filled with poetic flourishes, now they discussed the ordering of new garments, the hiring of servants, the readiness of a new home. The romance did not vanish, but it became laced with logistics: who would host the wedding breakfast, which pews would be reserved at the parish church, when the trousseau would be complete. And yet, the blending of business and affection did not necessarily dampen the emotion. For many couples, these later letters, half love note, half contract, were cherished as much as the earliest exchanges. They were tangible records of a shared future being constructed in ink and sealed in wax. But not every courtship letter led to marriage. Some were broken off abruptly, others fizzled quietly, leaving behind a ribbon-bound stack of unsent drafts or unfinished replies. And in London's second-hand bookstores and rag shops, bundles of old letters sometimes appeared for sale, their careful words read by strangers who could only guess at the stories behind them. Thus, in the 18th century, a love letter might be a whispered secret, a family bargaining chip, a legal weapon, or simply a fragment of hope pressed flat between the pages of time. And in each case, the letter was both more fragile and more enduring than the emotions it carried. In Regency-era London, a ball was more than an evening of music and movement. It was a structured performance of social life, where every gesture, glance, and choice of partner could carry layers of meaning. The chandeliers glittered, the floors gleamed from recent polishing, and the air held the faint mingling sense of beeswax, perfume, and anticipation. But amid the sparkle and chatter, a small, seemingly inconsequential object held a quiet power over the evening's events: the dance card. A dance card was a slender booklet, often no larger than the palm of one's hand, attached to a delicate ribbon or cord so that a lady might wear it at her wrist or hang it from her reticule. Inside, neat columns listed the dances in their planned order: the waltz, the quadrille, the country reel, each with a blank space beside it. Into these spaces, gentlemen's names were inscribed, reserving a turn around the floor in advance. On the surface, the card was simply a polite aid to memory, but to the practiced eye, it was also a subtle ledger of preference and possibility. A lady's first dance of the evening was often the most sought after. The final dance could hint at whose company she most enjoyed. If a gentleman's name appeared more than once, it was noticed. If it appeared not at all, that was noticed too. The very act of requesting a dance was a small negotiation. A man might cross the room with practiced nonchalance, bow, and ask if a particular dance was yet unclaimed. A lady might smile and nod or, just as politely, explain that it had already been promised, whether or not that was strictly true. In this way, the card became a shield as well as an invitation. For some, these exchanges were light-hearted. For others, they were deeply strategic. Mothers with marriageable daughters might nudge them towards certain partners, suggesting that an unfilled waltz was the perfect opportunity to speak to Mr. So, and so, whose family's country estate was particularly fine. Gentlemen might angle for the later dances, when the crowd thinned and conversation could grow more relaxed. And between those who had an unspoken attachment, the dance card could be as intimate as a whispered note, a small flourish added to a name, a playful underlining, or the deliberate choice to forget, to fill in a space until a certain person arrived. All these were small messages, legible only to the intended recipient. While the orchestra tuned their instruments, and the hum of voices rose toward the first notes of the evening, the dance card hung lightly at the wrist, its blank spaces like unwritten pages, each waiting to be filled with a memory. And in the quiet language of Regency romance, those little booklets sometimes spoke louder than any declaration of love. Almack's Assembly Rooms in King Street was perhaps the most exclusive ballroom in all of Regency London. Its chalk-white walls, crystal chandeliers, and polished wooden floorboards were familiar to anyone of consequence in society. But to be admitted was a privilege, controlled by a select group of patronesses whose approval could make or unmake reputations. On this particular spring evening in 1815, the ballroom was awash with soft candlelight. Footmen moved briskly, trimming wicks and refreshing the candelabra, ensuring that every corner glowed evenly. Ladies' gowns in silk and muslin shimmered as they passed beneath the chandeliers, their skirts whispering across the floor. Gentlemen stood in small knots near the edge of the room, their coats of deep blue and black offset by spotless white cravats. At the entrance, a steady procession of guests paused to exchange greetings before moving to the central floor. It was here that the dance cards came into play. Ladies carried them discreetly, but every gentleman who approached could see the faint outlines of names already penned inside. For a young lady making her first season, such as Miss Eleanor Whitcomb, the card was both a social safeguard and a subtle measure of her reception among the ton. She had been brought to Almack's by her aunt, who had drilled into her the importance of never leaving the first few dances empty. That evening, she accepted a cotillion with Mr. Fairfax, a reel with Captain Denham, and, most importantly, a waltz with Lord Ashcombe, whose interest in her had been whispered about for weeks. Yet the real intrigue came with the later dances. As the orchestra began a lively quadrille, Eleanor noticed a gentleman lingering at the edge of the crowd. Mr. Henry Talbot, known for his reserved manner, and for rarely dancing more than once in an evening. He approached with a quiet bow and asked whether her final waltz had been spoken for. It had not. With a calm smile, She offered her card, and his name appeared in the last empty space. It was a small moment, barely remarked upon by those nearby, but for Eleanor it carried a weight she could not quite explain. Throughout the evening, she danced, laughed, and conversed, yet her thoughts returned again and again to the last waltz, now waiting for her and Mr. Talbot. In the careful choreography of Almack's, this was no accident. A final dance was often more private than the first, with many guests already leaving, the air cooler, the music softer. If a gentleman chose it, he was claiming a kind of quiet exclusivity, a moment apart from the structured whirl of society. But what exactly did Mr. Talbot mean by it? Was it merely convenience, or something more deliberate? By the time the final waltz was announced, the air in Almack's had softened into that peculiar hush that comes at the tail end of an evening. The musicians, slightly wary yet still precise, struck the first lingering chords. Couples took their places on the floor, their steps a little slower, their voices quieter than before. Eleanor Whitcomb stood near the edge, card in hand, scanning the thinning crowd. Mr. Talbot emerged from the far side of the room, his black coat neatly cut, his gaze fixed steadily upon her. He moved without haste, bowing as he approached, and offered his arm. As they began to dance, the candlelight flickered faintly across their faces. The waltz, still considered a daring dance by some older patrons, required them to move in close measure, her gloved hand resting lightly in his other hand at the small of her back. The rotation of the steps gave Eleanor brief glimpses of the chandelier above, the shadows at the wall, and then always his face again. They spoke little, only the occasional remark about the music, the pleasantness of the evening. Yet within that absence of talk, there was a conversation of another sort. The faint pressure of his hand, the steadiness of his step, the way his eyes held hers when the turn of the dance allowed. These were things that could never be written plainly in a letter or stated at a crowded supper table. When the final strains of music began to fade, Mr. Talbot did not at once release her hand. Instead, he led her toward the refreshment table, where the last of the lemonade stood in tall, thin glasses. He passed one to her, then glanced down at her card, still tucked neatly at her side. "You have kept it well filled," he said, almost absently. "It has been a pleasant evening," she replied, her tone as composed as she could make it. He paused for a moment before speaking again. "I should like to see that card again, perhaps at the next assembly, if you would save me the same place." It was hardly a declaration, but in the careful speech of Regency courtship, it was more than enough. Eleanor felt the warmth of understanding in that quiet moment. The dance card had spoken its message without a single word written upon it, save for the final name. And so, as Almack's chandeliers dimmed and the night air cooled beyond its tall windows, two people left with more than they had arrived with. Not a betrothal, not even a promise, just the first thread of something that would be woven, step by step, into their future. In a society that prized decorum and subtlety, it was often the smallest gestures, the last dance, a name in a final blank space, that carried the most meaning. And perhaps that is why, in the annals of quiet romances, the dance card remains less a relic of paper than a silent letter between two hearts. In the London of the mid-19th century, tea was not merely a beverage. It was a quiet ritual, a currency of manners, and, though few would say it aloud, a stage for subtle courtship. The city's growing middle class found itself with something unusual leisure hours, disposable income, and a desire to be seen in respectable, sociable settings. From this combination emerged a new kind of public space, the tea shop. Unlike the rough and tumble coffee houses of the 18th century, with their political pamphlets and smoke-filled debates, tea shops cultivated refinement. They were often attached to milliners, booksellers, or fine grocers, their front windows displaying neatly stacked tins, gleaming porcelain, and, occasionally, tall glass jars of preserved fruits. The tables inside were small and close enough to overhear the next party's conversation, yet arranged with just enough privacy for a well-mannered exchange. A tea shop in 1850s London smelled of warm leaves and fresh baking. The clink of china cups was a kind of background music, joined by the faint hiss of the kettle and the low murmur of patrons' voices. For a young man or woman seeking to meet someone outside of the strict structure of family drawing rooms, this was a rare middle ground, public enough to be respectable, private enough for conversation to flow without the constant supervision of chaperones. The rules, of course, were unspoken but ironclad. A gentleman could not simply take a seat at a lady's table. He might instead arrange, through a mutual acquaintance, to happen to be in the shop at the same time. Greetings would be exchanged, hats tipped, and perhaps, if fortune allowed, a shared table might be suggested due to a lack of available seats. And so the ritual began: the ordering of tea, the negotiation over whether one preferred milk poured before or after, the passing of the sugar tongs. Each action offered an opening for gentle banter, each sip of tea a pause in which a look could be held a moment too long. By the late 19th century, the tea shop had even begun to appear in courtship columns, often coded as a place for agreeable conversation. But in these early decades, it was still a relatively novel setting, and the couples who braved its soft intimacy did so with care. Our story begins in one such shop on the Strand, where the late afternoon light filtered through lace curtains, and two porcelain cups sat steaming between a young clerk named Henry Calder and Miss Margaret Elwood, the daughter of a modest stationer. They had met twice before, once in church, once at a book sale, and both knew the other's presence here today was no accident. Henry stirred his tea, glancing up at her with the faintest of smiles. "Do you take lemon, Miss Elwood?" he asked, as though the question were only about tea. She returned the smile, and in that small exchange, the rest of the afternoon seemed to hold its breath. What neither could guess was that this quiet encounter, framed by the scent of Assam and the glow of late sunlight, would mark the beginning of a pattern. Regular visits, careful timing, and the gradual weaving of two lives together, one cup at a time. But for now, the tea was hot, the shop was calm, and every word they spoke floated somewhere between polite conversation and something that could, one day, be called affection. For Henry and Margaret, the tea shop became a stage where the smallest gestures carried layered meanings. In a world where propriety reigned, the tilt of a cup, the speed of a pour, even the way a teaspoon was placed on its saucer could communicate as clearly as spoken words, if one knew how to read them. Margaret had learned, from her elder sister, that lingering a fraction longer than necessary while passing the sugar could suggest interest, though only to a gentleman paying close attention. Henry, for his part, had read in a light-hearted column of the Illustrated London News that if a lady's cup was placed on the far side of the table after a refill, it was meant to prolong the act of retrieving it. Whether or not such codes were truly universal hardly mattered. The belief in them made each shared moment feel charged with significance. Afternoons passed in this delicate choreography. Their conversation ranged from the latest cereal in household words to the merits of Darjeeling over Ceylon tea. Henry found himself making deliberate detours in his day, leaving his clerk's desk at 4:15 instead of the usual 5, just to arrive in time for Margaret's visits. She, in turn, adjusted her errands so that her steps, naturally, carried her past the shop just as the lamps were being lit. The staff began to notice. Mrs. Keating, the proprietress, took to seating them at a small round table by the window, which she claimed was for better light, but which conveniently allowed them to be seen, and, perhaps, admired, by passers-by. One elderly regular even teased Margaret one afternoon, murmuring, "Best tea tastes sweeter when it's shared," before shuffling off with her own pot. Beyond the china and polite conversation, the tea shop offered something that both Henry and Margaret lacked elsewhere: unhurried time. At home, Margaret's hours were filled with sewing, household duties, and the watchful presence of her aunt. Henry's boarding house afforded little privacy, and his evenings were claimed by ledgers and correspondence. But here, amid the gentle hum of conversation and the faint clatter from the kitchen, they could sit without explanation, their shared silences as comfortable as their exchanges. Still, each meeting carried its risks. A casual acquaintance could become gossip if seen too often in the same place. And so they varied their days. occasionally bringing along a cousin or mutual friend, a small precaution to maintain the veneer of pure social coincidence. On one particularly damp February afternoon, as raindrops patterned the shop's windows, Henry noticed a bead of water slide from Margaret's glove as she removed it. Without thinking, he reached to take it from her, placing it gently on the edge of the table to dry. The moment was brief, but something in her look, a quiet acknowledgement, a flicker of warmth, left him turning it over in his mind long after she had gone. Such was the nature of tea shop encounters in London's gentler corners. Nothing so direct as a declaration, yet everything necessary to imagine what might come next. By the spring of 1864, the rhythm of Henry and Margaret's tea shop meetings had become almost unspoken tradition. Each week, they found themselves drawn to that same small table near the window, their cups and saucers serving as silent witnesses to the slow unfolding of a courtship that neither dared to name outright. Outside, London was shaking off the grey of winter. Market stalls spilled into the streets with flowers, and the scent of hyacinths and violets drifted through the shop door whenever it opened. Mrs. Keating began placing fresh blossoms in a small glass vase on their table, a gesture Margaret insisted was for all customers, though the way Mrs. Keating's eyes twinkled said otherwise. The signs of change were subtle at first. Henry, who once sat stiffly with his hat on his knee, now rested his hand casually on the table between sips, as though ready to reach across should the moment allow. Margaret, who had always kept her gloves on until her tea cooled, began removing them sooner, folding them neatly beside her saucer, as if signalling her comfort in his company. It was during one of these spring afternoons that Henry brought a small parcel from a Fleet Street bookseller. Poems by Alfred Tennyson bound in green cloth. "For your aunt, perhaps," he said with studied carelessness, though the volume bore Margaret's initials in gold lettering on the inside cover. She opened it, running her fingers lightly over the inscription, and gave the smallest of smiles before tucking it into her reticule. The intimacy of their meetings deepened not through bold acts, but through these quiet, deliberate offerings. Sugar passed without asking. Tea poured before the other's cup was empty. A shared glance when a sudden gust rattled the shop door. To an outsider, it was merely polite civility. To them, it was a conversation layered in meaning. As summer drew nearer, they began to take short walks after tea. The narrow lanes between Cheapside and the river offered a measure of privacy, though always within the bounds of propriety. Margaret would pause to look into a shop window, Henry standing just close enough that his sleeve brushed hers. The first time it happened, neither mentioned it. The second time, she did not step away. Rumours of engagement in 19th century London often began in such places, not in drawing rooms or at grand balls, but in the unnoticed corners of ordinary life. Whether this particular tea shop story would end in a proposal remained, for the moment, unknown. But one late June afternoon, as they lingered over their second pot of Darjeeling and the sunlight turned the porcelain cups almost translucent, Henry found himself wondering not if he should ask, but when. After all, in the slow and proper dance of London courtship, tea could very well be the first step toward a lifetime. In the London of the 1870s, a lady's fan was more than an accessory. It was a language, delicate, subtle, and capable of speaking what words could not. The folding fan, painted with flowers or edged with lace, moved through the air like a coded whisper. A proper young woman in Victorian society could not speak openly of admiration or desire. To do so would be to invite gossip, suspicion, or worse, the loss of her reputation. But with a fan in hand, she could convey a wealth of meaning, provided the right eyes were watching. Holding it to the left cheek might mean no. To the right, yes. Slowly opening it suggested curiosity, snapping it shut, displeasure. In the drawing rooms of Belgravia and Mayfair, where the heat from a dozen gas lamps made the air stifling, women sat with their fans in constant motion, fluttering not just for comfort but for conversation without sound. The untrained saw only idle fanning. Those in the know understood it as a slow and deliberate script. It was during such an evening at the house of Mrs. Ashworth, a well-known hostess, that Eleanor Bright first tried her hand at the art. She was 23, with a figure her aunt declared perfectly presentable, and a mind she had been warned not to display too freely. The room was crowded with guests. A quartet played softly in the corner, and the scent of lilies floated in from the hallway. She sat near the fireplace, her fan half open in her lap, when she noticed a gentleman across the room, a tall man in a dark frock coat, speaking with her cousin. Their eyes met for the briefest of moments before she looked away. Her fingers, almost of their own accord, began to move the fan, open, close, open, slowly, rhythmically. If he recognized the signal, he gave no immediate sign. Instead, he made his way around the room, pausing to speak to others. It was nearly 20 minutes before he approached her corner, offering some polite remark about the weather. But Eleanor knew better than to answer quickly. She tilted the fan to the right side of her face, lowering her eyes, then closed it halfway and placed it on her lap. The conversation that followed was entirely proper, discussions of music, the architecture of St. Paul's, the latest Royal Academy exhibition. Yet beneath it ran the unspoken current of the fan's quiet messages, a thread connecting them, without a single improper word. In this society, it was not enough to be charming or well-dressed. One had to master the unspoken. And as Eleanor left that evening, stepping into her father's waiting carriage, she wondered whether the gentleman had fully understood her signals, or whether she would need another chance to test the language of fans. The following afternoon, Eleanor found herself in her aunt's parlour, the winter sunlight filtering through heavy damask curtains. Spread across the low mahogany table were 3 fans, one of painted silk, one of carved ivory, and one of black lace. Her aunt, Mrs. Pennington, was a woman of impeccable breeding and the opinion that no girl should be sent into society without the proper tools. "Your fan," she declared, "is your shield, your sword, and your veil. It can invite, it can dismiss, and it can protect your dignity better than a chaperone." Eleanor listened as her aunt recited the code, a collection of gestures that, she claimed, had been passed through generations of ladies. To place the closed fan in the right hand signified agreement, in the left, rejection. Fanning rapidly showed impatience. Resting it on the right cheek meant, "I love you," while the left cheek meant, "I am indifferent." Dropping it was an accidental or deliberate signal for, "We are being watched," her aunt demonstrated with precision. Her movements slow, deliberate, and confident. "The key," she explained, "is to act as though your gestures mean nothing at all to those who do not understand. The charm is in secrecy. You must never betray that you are saying something of importance." That evening, at a small dinner hosted by the Howards of Russell Square, Eleanor found her opportunity. The same gentleman from Mrs. Ashworth's gathering, Mr. Edward Latham, was present, seated across the table from her. Conversation flowed about railway expansions and the Prince of Wales's latest appearances, but Eleanor's attention was on her fan, a pale silk piece adorned with painted violets. As the dessert course was served, she tilted her fan slightly toward her right cheek, holding it there just long enough for him to notice. His eyes flickered, just a fraction, before he returned to listening to a gentleman beside him discuss the merits of gas lighting over oil lamps. Later, in the drawing room, he approached with a cup of tea in hand. Their talk was again entirely proper, but there was a hint of something else in the way he lingered after each reply, as though testing whether she might signal again. Eleanor, sensing his curiosity, gave him a slow, deliberate sweep of the fan across her face before lowering it into her lap. Whether he understood the meaning or not, there was no denying that a silent game had begun, and in a society where everything was watched, judged, and recorded in whispers, a game of secrecy was far more thrilling than any open declaration. But Eleanor also knew that every gesture she made was a risk. One misinterpreted sign, one careless movement, and she could invite scandal, or worse, the wrong suitor's attentions. By the following Thursday, Eleanor had been invited to a charity musicale at Lady Wexford's grand home in Belgravia. The evening promised the usual mixture of amateur singing, polite applause, and strategically arranged social encounters. The drawing room was lit by dozens of candles, their flames flickering against tall mirrors and gilded frames. Soft murmurs filled the air as guests found their seats, fanning themselves against the warmth of the crowded space. Eleanor, dressed in pale blue satin, carried the same violet, painted fan she had used at the Howards. She spotted Mr. Latham almost at once. He stood near the far wall, conversing with a tall gentleman whose stance suggested a lifelong familiarity with military discipline. Though surrounded by others, his eyes sought hers almost immediately, and she felt the quiet recognition pass between them like the faintest of currents. Throughout the evening, she used her fan sparingly, resting it on the right cheek once during a particularly dull soprano solo, lowering it suddenly when a young lady in green passed too closely. Each time, she sensed him watching. Then, during the interval, something happened that broke the game's careful rhythm. A different gentleman, one whose attentions Eleanor had quietly discouraged for weeks, approached and attempted to monopolize her conversation. The man spoke at length about his horses, leaning in far too closely for propriety's comfort. Eleanor, without breaking her polite smile, raised her fan and began fanning herself rapidly, a signal her aunt had said meant impatience or irritation. She saw Mr. Latham glance over, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly. Moments later, as the unwanted suitor was finally drawn away by another guest, Mr. Latham crossed the room and bowed slightly. "Miss Fairfax," he said, "I believe you may find the air in the conservatory more agreeable." In the small, plant-filled conservatory, away from the press of the crowd, Eleanor closed her fan and rested it in her right hand. The gesture was deliberate, unmistakable. "I believe," she said softly, "you have learned the code rather well." He smiled faintly. Only enough to know when a lady is in need of rescue. Their conversation remained proper. There were no declarations, no promises. But from that moment, the silent game was no longer a game at all. The language of fans had done what polite introductions and formal dances could not. It had allowed them to speak freely without a single improper word. In the weeks to come, their meetings would continue under the watchful gaze of chaperones, and their signals, subtle, fleeting, would pass unnoticed by most. Yet for Eleanor and Mr. Latham, those small movements of silk and ivory carried the weight of entire conversations, and perhaps the beginnings of something far more permanent.